My name is Juandiego Fonseca. I am from Ecuador in South America. I currently work as a chemical engineering teacher in San Francisco de Quito University. And also, we can maybe talk a little bit more about that later, but besides chemical engineering, I also give other classes, such as Japanese language classes and a Socratic course, which is called Self-Knowledge, which is also quite an interesting class that every student that enters this university has to take. And it's about Eastern philosophy. So it's kind of an interesting curriculum for them to take. Besides that, I'm currently focusing my practice in Kyudo. I practice Kyudo since 2010 when I went to Japan to study my graduate studies. And lately I have been in a little bit of a pause, but I also am a long-time Kendo practitioner, about maybe 16 years of Kendo practice. But lately I have been working harder or focusing in Kyudo over Kendo, really.
Okay, so you grew up in Ecuador, and that's yeah. So what was the circumstances around that? I think that a lot of people listening to this podcast are from all over the world. It'd be just a good glimpse into what life is like, what growing up as a child in your country is like.
Right. So in Ecuador, well, when I was a kid, I moved to several places, especially in Venezuela. I spent a long time in my childhood, around, I believe, more than 6 years in Venezuela. And actually, you know, I always had to travel a little bit, even though I was always in Ecuador. I usually travel to Venezuela and also to Curacao in the Caribbean. And the reason is because my family is kind of a very mixed, really. Like my heritage from my dad and from my mother are very separate. And I happened to happen in Ecuador, I could say. So for example, my dad is a mixture between Lebanese and Dutch, but with a relationship to the Caribbean in Curacao, while my mother is a mixture between England and Ecuadorian, you know, so yeah, it was a little bit strange for me growing up in Ecuador, because I was always a little bit different from most of the people, what you would think Ecuadorians look like. So yeah, it was always a little bit, I always felt a little bit like a foreigner, even in Ecuador.
So that probably has some, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're exploring Japanese culture and this other things. When did that begin? Was it because you had this already difference in interests in terms of your upbringing?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I wasn't very interested in the typical Ecuadorian things, which would be soccer, basically. And the cultural background in Ecuador, even when I was a kid, never really interested me. So I was always doing a little bit strange things. And my source of strange things was Japan, you know. So since I was a kid, I was very interested in video games, especially. I was a very, very, how would you say, very zealous gamer when I was a kid. And also I really liked origami. So I've been practicing for a very long time. And especially, I think that one of my very first interests in Japan per se was because of video games. And the reason was because in Ecuador, you know, when I was a kid, it was very hard to get such things as video games. So you had to get them from the black market. And many from the games I had to go get when I was a kid, you know, this is a 8-9-year-old doing this, you know, taking a bus and going to the black market to buy games. And many of them were Japanese games, you know, the ones that are like short, that you had to put an adapter to play. And the thing is that these games were in Japanese. So I started a little bit kind of my interest in Japan and in Japanese language, trying to figure out how to read what was written in the screen. So for example, I would know the character names, and then I would see what lines were written, and little by little I tried to kind of teach myself hiragana and katakana through video games. So I think that was the beginning of a very long lifetime romance with Japan and Japanese culture.
Oh, wow. Well, so we had this exploration, this interest in the other culture. The other side of doing something like a Budo art is a lot of discipline. Did you see that coming before? Like, was that in your personality or in your interest before you started practice, or did it come as a result?
Well, I think that I did have an increasing interest in discipline. I think that maybe one of the reasons for this is that when I was a kid, I was very overweight, and it took a lot of effort for me to get over that phase. When I came to Ecuador after some years of living in Venezuela and coming back, it was a little bit of a shock for me. The food in Ecuador is very tasty and very, a lot of potatoes and cheese and corn and stuff that makes you fat. So, I was overweight, and that lasted for a few years until, it started having some implications in my personal life. So I decided this has to change. So then I started looking for a good training regime. And one of the things that I started doing was practicing yoga and also a little bit of Taekwondo, which was the martial art that was kind of available to me at that time. And that was like the beginning of me starting a discipline. Then I continued to practice Taekwondo for a couple years until I got into the university. And in the university, I took up fencing. And I was really into fencing. I really enjoyed it. But then, thanks to fencing, is that I found Kendo. It's a little bit an anecdote is that my fencing teacher, he was like, there's also this Japanese fencing club that they're going to start in the university. And how about you go and check it out? And well, that teacher could not foresee it, but that was the very last day I practiced fencing. Actually, I never again, after the day I saw Kendo, even grabbed an epee, never again. And from the next week, I joined Kendo and I never stopped.
So Kendo, you said it's something that you still kind of dabble in, but now your main art is Kyudo. So maybe you can walk us through how that discovery. I know that you've started practicing in Japan, but you already had that interest in pursuing it before. So how would you even know that something like that exists?
Right. So when I started practicing Kendo, one of the things that I really love about Kendo that I have even appreciate more as time passed is this ability for you to practice in several dojo without rivalry or without, I think it's not the same in all the places, but at least in Ecuador, is a very, very healthy dojo atmosphere regarding Kendo. So when I started practicing Kendo in the university, I also started practicing everywhere where I could. And I met many different teachers. And the thing is that during these interactions with many different teachers, sometimes we will have conversations about the deeper sides of Budo and of the practice. And Kyudo would always come up, in conversations, like we've heard this, that Kyudo is very spiritual, very deep kind of thing. And it was always, I think for all Ecuadorians, it was very, like a very mysterious and distant Budo. So I had my aim to that. I practiced for a few years, maybe 5 or 6 years in my university Kendo. And then when I decided to go to Japan, I applied for a scholarship and got it. And then I was thinking like what to do. And of course I was going to continue to practice Kendo. But also I had this possibility to start practicing something that was almost impossible to practice in Ecuador, So I think it was out of just sheer curiosity, but a little bit more precisely, like a very specific chapter. I would say that I remember as one of the first times I heard about Kyudo was with the president of the Kendo Association in Ecuador. And he had read the Herrigel books and he started talking to me about it. And actually he lent me a copy in Spanish and I read it. At that time, it was actually one of those things that change your life completely, but it's very random because when I started, I read this book and I thought it was really cool. My opinion about this book has changed a lot throughout the years, but at the time I thought it was really cool. And it was so cool actually that when I applied for a scholarship to go to Japan, I chose Sendai, Tohoku University, because of the relation it had to this. So I said, okay, it's a great university for what I have to study. And there's also this link with Kyudo. And if I'm gonna, go all out and study Kyudo, why not I go to Sendai? And that was I would say that decision was not the best decision Kyudo-wise, but it was a great decision in terms of my life. And why I say this is because I expected there to be a very strong Kyudo in Sendai, but really it was not so. So actually, like, I think that there could have been better places for me to start Kyudo practice that would have been richer maybe. But definitely now that I see it, like I see it today, I am very, very happy that I actually chose Sendai, because I think that it was a great environment for me to then develop a little bit of my ideas. I think that if I had gone into another place, how can I say? I think that Sendai gave me some freedom, to practice in the community, but also a lot of self-practice that is required. That maybe in other places where the community and the Kyudo is stronger, you don't have this opportunity to develop by yourself. It's only community-based and very little self-practice. So I think that actually Sendai allowed that for me to happen.
So before we get into your practice and what you've discovered in Sendai, I'm always interested in hearing how people talk about finding and taking advantage of an opportunity to go to Japan, because I think a lot of people have that interest. And sure, there's luck involved in terms of an opportunity coming, but there's also a lot of work in terms of being aware of what's available and applying and making sure that you can get. Could you talk a little bit about the details of finding this opportunity to get the scholarship, and then what it took to apply and get accepted?
Yeah, sure. So, the Mombuka Kusho or MEXT scholarship is like an embassy endorsed scholarship that you apply to the university of the country. Well, this works differently in several countries, but at least in Ecuador, it works by a recommendation through the Japanese embassy. And it's a really great scholarship. We have every year, maybe 2 or 3 people that can be chosen for their maybe master's or doctor's study in Japan in any university. So it's a great opportunity. I found out in just, open the newspaper one morning, and it was, okay, you want to apply for a scholarship in Japan. These are the requirements. And so I did. But actually, by that time, I had already been studying Japanese for a few years. I had also been I had been practicing Kendo for some time, doing origami. Like my interest in Japan was already a little bit developed by the time I found out about this scholarship. So when I found out about this scholarship, I was working as an engineer. I had not graduated from high school, from the university, sorry, because my thesis was still not finished. But I had done all my courses, so I started working as a process engineer. So I think that it was very lucky for me, really. But I really think that it was a matter of me opening the newspaper that morning or not. So I think that for that not to be the case for more people, I've made one of my, I would say, main activities since I came back, the promotion of this opportunity in Japan, in Ecuador. So I work very closely with the Japanese embassy now, endorsing the program, trying to make it be known for the most people, and also advise on how to apply, how to be a good applicant, how to fill in the documents and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that for me it was a chance. But what I would really like to do is that for the next generations, it's not going to be a matter of chance, but more of choice.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's surprising how many of those type of stories where it's some kind of serendipity that happens that allows you to find these things. So talk about your stay there. How long were you there? Were you feeling like you were dove right into living as any other person would live in Japan? Was there any culture shock involved? Like, what was your time like while you were in Japan?
Right. So I joined the scholarship thinking about completing a doctor's degree. In Japan, that's about 3 years, plus 2 years for the master's, plus have a year that is made for research and, getting ready for the entrance examination and all that stuff. Plus, I stayed in Japan a little bit longer. Before coming back to Japan, I was already kind of deciding, to get married, coming back to Ecuador with my girlfriend at the time. Japanese girlfriend at the time. Now she's my wife. She's living here in Ecuador. She's a Japanese teacher, actually. So all in all, I stayed around 6 years in Japan. And I think that it was, yeah, I would say that it was a very normal stay, like, but I think that the way I used my time was definitely disproportionately aimed to Budo. Like I spent maybe 6 hours in the university, like doing my research and stuff. But for every hour I spent in the research, I think I spent at least 2 in the dojo. So I think that in that sense it was a little bit different. Like the amount of time I spent studying and doing Budo was a little bit disproportionate towards the Budo side. And another thing I think was a little bit different is that, for the first 6 months, and this was a great decision, if somebody's planning to go to Japan, I recommend you do something like this. When you just get to Japan, what is normal is that you come together with a group of other international students and you make this group and you never leave, you're always traveling together, moving together. And what I did, I had kind of made this a strategy and it worked very well. I didn't want that to happen, for me to be distracted with my other foreign friends in Japan. So for the first 3, 4, or 5 months, I was basically alone. I tried not to talk in English. I tried to, if I wanted to go somewhere, go alone. And if I get lost, ask for the directions. So my strategy was to be completely independent as much as possible from non-Japanese community for the first 6 months. And that was very good. At the beginning, my fellow international scholarship students thought I was a little bit crazy, because he's always alone, kind of weird. But during this time, I was able to really submerge in the Japanese, living in Japan and talking in Japanese and asking for the directions and doing all the procedures to get the phone and the bills, all this kind of stuff. And then when I finally took the decision to join the international community, I was able to help them because, I had made progress in Japanese that they had not been able to do. So then it was better for me to get very established in Japan before I open up to the other international community. And this way I was also more helpful for them. So I think that was a little bit different in my case.
And Howard, so you have these foreign friends that are at the university, and then going out, like if you were just checking out the town and all that stuff, most of the people are Japanese. What about at the dojo? Like what kind of environment was it like? And did you have any, were there any interesting stories from that period of time?
Right. So one of the things in Sendai is that it's a very small city compared to Tokyo. And one of the things that this means is that there are not too many foreigners in Sendai. Although I would say that Sendai is in great part Tohoku University. And of course, in Tohoku University, there are many international students. But most people that are not related to the university, it's not very common from people there to interact with foreigners. So it happened to me in Sendai many times that I was the first foreigner that made baby saw, So it was kind of, I caused that shock to many babies. And in general, there were certain places where there were not many foreigners. I think that even in comparison to other places in Japan, it was, very few. And one of these places was Kyudo, in the Kyudojo and the Kendojo. And if there were other foreigners, they were most of the times in the same situation as me. Like they were very close friends of mine, or they came to Japan at the same time with me or something like that. So my practice in the dojo was also, especially for Kyudo, it was very only with Japanese people, say for a couple of international friends that there were. But for example, the first time I went to the dojo, I just searched where the closest dojo was to my university dorm, look for the schedule, and then just show up and literally knock the door. Excuse me, I want to practice Kyudo, but where should I start? Please help me. It was literally like that. And yeah, I do have an interesting story about the first time I went to the dojo. So I stepped into the dojo, which is a municipal dojo, so it's not kind of very traditional, but more of a modern building dojo. And as I tell you, I entered like very carefully, like, I'm sorry, I want to learn, but I don't know where to start. Can somebody help me? And somebody crossed the corridor, and a man maybe in his 50s with a kimono. He looked at me and ignored me completely. And then I was like, again, sorry, is there somebody here? And then he turned out again his head, looked at me, and went back into the room. I was like, okay, what's wrong with this guy? And I kept on calling until somebody came, and then the sensei came, and he told me, oh yeah, welcome, come here, and he started guiding me. And he started talking, like showing me the equipment and stuff. And all of the time, this man with the kimono was always kind of checking me out, but kind of with a weird face, like looking at me like very suspiciously. And it was a very strange sensation until about an hour and a half later, there was a tea time. Many times in Kyudo practice in Japan, they make a little break for people to talk. And finally, this mysterious man talked, and he changed his face completely from this expression of, you're weird, you're not welcome. He became very friendly and started speaking Spanish. He started saying like, hey, how are you, amigo? And he introduced himself, and he said, I've been to your country, I know Ecuador. And then, to my surprise, at that moment, there were like him, the sensei, and like 3 or 4 more people practicing, like younger people. And then he said, well, I'm Mr. Camito, and this is my 2 daughters and my son. So, it was the entire Camito family was there in the dojo. And what happened, to make this long story very short, is that I was basically adopted by Camito-san and his family all the time when I was in Japan. He invited me to his house. That was the place where I felt like I was in a family, really. I celebrated birthdays, holidays, everything I did together with them. So they actually took me almost like an adopted son, I would say. And this was very important for my Kyudo practice because Camito-san, during all my stay in Japan, he always made sure that I knew what was going on in the Kyudo community. He always drove me every single time to practice. And that was great because he practiced almost every day. So that also meant that if I had time available, I could also go to practice with him almost every day if I wanted to. So yeah, I made this connection the very first time I entered the dojo in Sendai. And it was like one of the most important people in my life, and certainly the most important person in my Kyudo.
Yeah, and like of all the places that he could have been worldwide, he came from where you came from. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. And Camito-san is like a very unusual Japanese person because he's at the same time extremely Japanese and at the same time extremely non-Japanese. So he's extremely Japanese in the sense that his family is very traditional, like he's the man of the house and he's always wearing a kimono. When he's in practice, always kimono, but also when he comes back to his house, he always gets in yukata, very traditional in this kind of way. He follows, like the almanac and the agricultural almanac, traditional almanacs and stuff like this. So very, very traditional. But in the other hand, Camito-san was a backpacker for many years, and he survived as a backpacker, like for 15 years, traveling all over the world. So that also makes him a very, most very Japanese people have never left Japan, but he was both very Japanese and very international at the same time. So you're going to be like celebrating a very traditional thing in a family setting, but listening to Bob Marley, for example. So it was this contrast that was very interesting to find in him.
Yeah, and that would have totally broken all expectations for what you had when you said, oh, I'm just going to go to Japan and learn Kyudo, and then you get adopted by this family. Well, was there other points, like, I know you read the Haribo book, there would have been a huge change from what you thought that was and what else? Maybe you can talk about, as you were practicing more, what are some of the things that you learned and you came to realize when you were practicing these arts in Japan?
Right. So, for example, one of my things that I appreciated that book a lot because it told me about Kyudo and all this possibility of a very interesting dimension of practice that I think that it attracts many of us to Budo practice. And at a certain point, I went through a phase of rejection of the book. I think this also is very common, and it has to do, of course, with all the Zen thing. I had been interested in Zen for a very long time. I had practiced Zen meditation since I was in the university. As you heard, in my university, there is a class that you have to take in the first semester that is basically about Eastern philosophy and practices. So I had been practicing for a long time, and I really was into Zen. So I studied about it, and I always combine the practical part with also the academic studies. So I have been very interested in Buddhism, especially in an academic sense, for a long time. So, when there's this kind of, how can you say, sometimes it doesn't really match what's going on in the book with the Zen thing. And, I know you have also had Errol Hartman in the podcast. So, I read the paper he translated and everything. And then I started thinking critically about Zen, And then as I started dwelling a little bit more, how would you say, more objectively into Zen, because I was like really into Zen, so it was not very objective. It was kind of like, very partialized way of looking at it. But then I look at it a little bit more objectively, and there were some things that I started that I didn't think they matched very well. And it also didn't really match my experience in Kyudo. So there was this phase of not liking the book. However, the thing is that I was a little bit disappointed in a sense, but I think that for a long time, my disappointment was not in the right place. Like, I was kind of disappointed in the Awa Sensei aspect, let's say. Well, I should have been a little bit more disappointed just in the Herigal kind of way. So why do I mean? What do I mean with this? Is that, I think that my appreciation for Awa Sensei and his philosophy and his experiences and all these things was a little bit damaged by the way it was portrayed in Herigal's book. Because I think that by trying to give it a deeper dimension, it actually kind of directed it in a direction which is not the correct one. So I think that he was not a good teller of Awa Sensei's experience. Maybe that would be. But then, through the years, I have reconciled a little bit with it, and both with the Herigal and the book and with Awa, I've made peace with that. Now I really like the book again, although with very careful when we're discussing about it. But especially, I have regained a deeper interest and also appreciation for Awa Sensei and his ideas. And I really think that his philosophy is not well understood. I think it has not been well communicated. And, now I'm looking deeper into it, and I'm finding it very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I can imagine that someone like you that's very introspective and very into researching these things, that I'm kind of interested to hear in a couple of years or in whatever time it takes to see what this new take on his work is going to be like, because I know that you're already doing a lot in terms of helping communicate a lot more that hasn't been passed on outside of Japan. So you've had this practice, you're there for school, although you're spending more of your time in the dojo. I think you also did something else. You worked on this documentary. Can you talk about?
Oh, yeah. So, well, I work in a series of documentaries with Empty Mind Films. The first one is this one, One Shot, One Life. Maybe you have seen it. I think that some people in the Kyudo community have seen it. So, this, it was also very good. I don't know if you want to hear a little story of how that began.
Yeah, absolutely. Talk fully. I want to know all the behind the scenes details.
Right. So I was actually traveling to Tokyo for a Kendo event. I think it was, yeah, it was a Kendo World, a Keikokai that they doing in Tokyo. And well, it was a fantastic day because that day I saw the best kata exposition I have seen in my life. You know, it was two women doing kata in the Budokan with Inoue Sensei like guiding them. No, it was a great event, really. But the thing is that at the end of this event, of this Keikokai, there was like a lucky, you know, like, how do you say this? Like Takanamikuji, like, you know, like everybody wins random prizes, kind of thing. So I won a prize and I won a DVD. I had won Empty Mind Films DVD. And I also knew that the person who made the DVD was there at the event. So I went to thank him for, you know, for bringing the DVD and to talk about it. And as I was approaching him, I heard him talking with somebody, and I heard the words Sendai, Tohoku University, Kyudo, Awakenso, and I was like, wait, this is very interesting. So I approached him, the director John Braley from Empty Minds Films, and I told him, like, you know, I wanted to thank you for bringing this DVD and because I won it and I'm gonna really enjoy watching it. But I heard some very interesting words when I was approaching you. And then we started talking, and he told me that he had these plans of making a 2-hour long Kyudo documentary, and that he was thinking of going to Sendai and Tohoku University. And told him, wait, that's where I live, that's where I study, so let me help you. And that's how we first got into contact. And that was the beginning of, wow, it was it ended up being not only this documentary about Kyudo, but also like 10 more shorter documentaries on different Budos. And we went all over to many places around Japan, filming and interviewing. So wow, that was a very, very interesting experience overall. You know, it required, well, you know, for most of the films, the work was basically made by him and me. And also there are also collaborators, but for most part of the job it was the two of us. I had to make contact with the organizations and establish contact, negotiate, also all the translation work of, you know, the questions that we were going to ask, the answers that came. So that was a very hard and a little bit, how would you say, exhausting work, because, you know, you contact these very important global Budo associations just as a foreign student in Japan. So, you know, it was very interesting to make that contact. But of course, the best part was going and doing the interviews. That was fantastic. Yeah, I had the chance of meeting many teachers throughout the filming. Yeah, it was really incredible to be able to talk to them. And one of the things that are not really appreciated when you see the documentaries is that maybe you have a clip that is only like 2 minutes, but in order to get those 2 minutes, there was like a 3-hour interview behind it. So, you know, it was great to have these 3-hour interviews with many teachers. So yeah, that was a great experience. Going back
the one point though that really resonates with me is like this reaching out part, because that's what this podcast is all about too. It's like all these people I had no idea, but somehow convinced them, especially in the beginning. So I'm just curious, from like a peer-to-peer kind of thing, like what did you say to them that convinced them to like take time and allow you into their space and take a camera too, because some like are very sacred areas. What kind of discussions did you have to go through?
Yeah, well, and one thing that I must tell you is that, you know, I talk a lot about translating and talking Japanese, but to be honest, I'm not so great at doing anything, you know, like I am not a very efficient worker. So for example, when I say that I have to do some like writing letters in Japanese and everything, this means that it took me many hours to do each of these things. Like somebody who would be more skillful than me would maybe take like 10 minutes to write a letter, but for me it took 3 days, you know? So it took a lot of work trying to ask in the most polite way, but also sometimes if you try to be too polite, it doesn't work. So I had to think about, do a little bit of research about each of the organizations, a little bit locate what they like, what they don't like, and then try to, when I approach them the first time, try to communicate that, I'm aware of what they like and they don't like. So I'm going to try to show what they like and try to not talk about what they don't like. And I think that this was very important in approaching these organizations in Japan. And, sometimes it's very complicated. For some Budo, I think that there's no problem between institutions, but for other Budo, there's like a very, how would you say, like very intense competition between dojos or groups. So for some Budo, I had to be very careful. For others, not so much. For example, for Kendo, for Kyudo, it was very, very easy. It was very easy to get in touch with them. And they were like, yeah, film whatever you want, But for other Budo, is if you film this, then you cannot film that. If you put that person, then I won't talk. This kind of thing that it was very hard to negotiate. And for some Budo, actually, like we had already made a film, and then they saw the film and they say, no, we don't like it at all. We want you to do it from the start again. And, it was very complicated depending on the Budo. So yeah, I could also make like a ranking of complicated Budo and welcoming Budo institutions. So yeah, it required a lot of research to be able to, that in this first approach, that you're not just blindly like, grasping out, but that what it is about, and that you have a little bit of information of what you should avoid when filming that particular institution.
Yeah, so there's definitely something there. You came as an engineer, doing a student and doing some Budo, and then you have to learn these like Budo politics and negotiation and all that. And then there's this other piece where you didn't mention anything about having filmmaking experience in the past. What kind of things did you have to learn on the spot? What were some of the cool lessons that you got from just watching him work?
Mm-hmm. Right. So in the field, for example, I had to do the whole interview and all of stuff, but also, it was kind of part of my job, getting to the places and making the schedule. All this planning was kind of like my responsibility. On the other hand, John, the director, he was the responsible of all the filming and the editing and all this other stuff. So I had to learn a lot to be able to assist him. So for example, I always had, it's like many things you have to do at the same time. You have to interview, but I also had like to have always a lens in my hand, because I know that sometimes he has to change lenses. So you have to do that in 5 seconds. And also the sound, you have to be holding the microphone and the distance, the lighting. So yeah, I had really to learn everything that John needed me to learn in order for his shots to work well. And this required me to study a little bit of learn from him a little bit of how to do the cinematography. I had some experience with photography. When I was in high school, I had a photography lab, I had experience doing this. So like, how do you call this? To actually print the photos?
Develop?
Yeah, exactly. So I had some experience in the black room and with photography. I had studied photography by myself for a few years. So, the things that he told me made sense instantly, but I had to learn a lot. And, also the other thing is that I think that John is a very creative person, and like creative people, sometimes they need to get into their own space, maybe their own selfish space, you could say, in which they are focused in their activity. So, like sometimes he will just like film here and then he will suddenly go somewhere and film something. So I had to respond immediately and try to understand what he's filming, and then try to make shadow or change the lens or whatever I had to do. So it was a very, very hard in that sense as well. Being an assistant for this kind of work, it requires a lot of attention, so it was a little bit stressful, but wow, it was very, very enriching. I learned a lot with him.
And you were still able to finish your degrees. after all that, I could imagine like, oh my God, I need to get out of here. There's just so much work.
So, you know, in my strategy, I don't recommend this strategy. I don't think it's a great strategy. It worked for me, but I don't recommend it to anybody. I would say that my progress, I was always in my studies trying to do what I had to do. You know, I won't say like do the least possible, but do what I had to do and try not to do anything else than what I had to do. And maybe the last 3 or 4 months before I had to give my thesis, both for the masters and for the doctors, then there was no dojo. Then there was like 3 months of me living in the room, you know, like basically day after day in front of the computer, finishing experiments. So the way I could spend a lot of time in Budo activity was doing this sacrifice that required me like full time in my studies for periods of 2 or 3 months. That was really, really terrible, you know. When I was finishing my doctor's degree, I think I like gained weight like in like 2 months, 8 kilograms or something like that. And it was just because I was sitting and writing my work.
Yeah, so there's school, there's dojo, there's this other thing. You also mentioned you met your wife there. Over like 6 years, some people are like, okay, it's time to head back home because it's just been here for a long time. What was your feeling around being in Japan, kind of fitting in with the group? Was it something like, oh, I could just stay here as long as I want, it's easy, but I still like my home, so I want to go back? Or was it like, I really need to get out of here? Maybe you can talk about over time, how was your feeling about living in Japan and if it changed? Right.
Yeah. So I definitely think that the best choice for me was to come back to Ecuador or just get out of Japan at that time. You know, I had noticed by meeting many foreigners in many seminars, you know, I tried to attend each and every seminar I possibly could during my stay in Japan. So, you know, international Budo University seminars, the Budo culture seminars, and the Nagoya Kyudo seminars, and some Kendo seminars, and so on. In the Kendo world, for example, I really enjoy those. And in these opportunities, I could meet a lot of foreigners that have been living in Japan for a long, long time. And I could see their experiences. And in general, I could evaluate that their experiences are not very good, really, you know. I think that for many young people, Japan is very tempting to stay. Also, you have many great opportunities when you are just graduated. But I feel that as time goes on, Japan doesn't treat foreigners very well as they age, I would say. Like, you know, maybe at the beginning, you can get a work position that is better than a Japanese person, but the difference is that 10 years later, you're still going to be in that exact position, while the Japanese person already had a career, you know. So I started noticing this, and I didn't think it was something I wanted in my future, you know, like lose relevance throughout time and trying to keep up with that. I thought that it was very taxing for the people I knew. So that was a part of it. You know, I kind of, I could see the experience of many people I had met that, you know, they were married in Japan, working in Japan. And even though they had great things like being able to practice in dojos and access to the best teachers and all that stuff, I think that their situation in total is not something I wanted for myself. And in the other hand, you know, I had this idea maybe planted on me by one of my Kyudo sensei in Sendai, that actually it was important for me to develop on my own. You know, it was, maybe can talk about it some other time too, but I had like 2 main Sendai teachers for Kyudo, and they were very different. One was very conservative, and the other was a little bit, I would say, maybe liberal. And I think those terms are not very adequate, but I would say that one was very, you know, do Kyudo exactly as the teacher tells you and do not deviate a single millimeter from that, very strict in that sense. While the other teacher was like, you know, try this and try that and try this and this other thing. So one teacher will teach me tenouchi is done like this and, you know, just like this. While the other one will tell me, you know, in this school, tenouchi is done like this, in this other school like that, in this school like that. So I had this contrast between maybe something that was a little bit dogmatic and something that was more experimental. And as time passed, at first I was very, very devoted to the conservative teacher, But as time passed, I started really appreciating what the other sensei was also teaching me, all these variations and all this diversity in shooting. And something very important that he told me once also helped me make this decision of coming back to Ecuador, is like, if you really want to be better, you will have to be by yourself. If you're always with the teachers, you're always going to be a student. So if you really want to learn, you have to be the teacher. So that for me was what really signaled that the right thing to do was, to get out of Japan. You miss the teachers and the access to the dojos and everything. But in the other hand, you are able to position yourself in a different role that can help you understand all the things you learned, by having to teach them. So yeah, I think that this was also very important in that decision.
I think what you mentioned is super valuable in terms of experience, because when someone goes to Japan for a short period of time, they might have just one type, like they might only experience the very rigid traditional style teaching and dojo, or the opposite one. And then they'll come back and they'll say, this is what Japanese dojo is like, when even within that country, it's very broad and different. So I'm curious, and because you've also attended a lot of seminars, what are the differences in terms of students, like in terms of how they behave, how they interact, how they shoot when you go to these things? Is it something where you go to a seminar and you can tell immediately, okay, this guy's from this type of dojo, this guy's not, or is it like all blended together?
Yeah, I think that it's easier for me to kind of differentiate this kind of thing. But normally, I think that it's hard to tell, to know in which term is correct to talk about this. But a word that keeps on showing up a lot lately in my thinking is dogma. I think that it's easy to recognize dogmatic people from non-dogmatic people, and I think that especially like people that have a very dogmatic training, you can tell that right away. And normally it's not because of very good things. It may be because of a little bit rigid, not only in their way of thinking, but also in their movements and in their gestures. So I think that it's a little bit possible to identify, what kind of Budo practice people are undertaking by being a short time with them in general.
And then like even in like North or in the West, you could see that some students prefer just to be told what to do, and then they're okay. And while others are more like, I want to be able to think for myself and get those options, and that kind of thinking. And I think I saw somewhere recently that's where younger Japanese are headed, even in this day and age, towards the more free thinking kind of role. So it seems like these more traditional older ones will start to fade away.
Right. And something that another thing that is related to what I was telling you about is that, I had these two sensei, right? I would say like the more dogmatic sensei and the more experimental sensei. And a little bit also the reason why I started focusing more in one more than the other is because for a very, very, very plain reason, the very conservative sensei has a very correct and very nice Japanese, while the other sensei, he has a very strong Tohoku accent. So it actually took me a couple years to be able to understand him. He was always very friendly with me and trying to teach me a lot, but I just couldn't understand him. It was very, very hard for me to get through that. So he was in a certain way, the conservative sensei was more international, while the not so conservative sensei was a little bit more local. But in a couple times, the local sensei, he made this, he caused a scene in the dojo at least twice, because what would happen is that we will be practicing and he will call me like, come here. And we will go to the Makiwara room, and then we will be like 1 hour and he will be teaching me all these variations of everything, this can be done like this, like this, like this. You combine, for example, this dotsukuri with this kind of thing, like different combinations of things. And And a couple times we would be interrupted while this was going to happen. And he got not angry, but he would say like, don't interrupt this. This is very important. Like you should follow his example. Sometimes he did this at least twice, like making a little bit of a scandal. Like, you should be like him. He's always asking and trying to understand. You just do what you're told. If it's up to you, Kyudo is going to be finished by the next generation. He told me, the future of Kyudo is in foreigners like Fonseca-san. If we continue practicing like you practice, this is going to be finished very soon. So this was very shocking for me, He was like, and I was like saying, sorry, I'm very sorry. I don't know what's going on. But now I understand what he meant. And this has also shaped a lot of my life. I agree with him. I think that in a certain way, if Budo practice continues this way, I think it's not going to be very long-lived in Japan, and I think that it's important to make progress. From our perspective, it would seem like, for example, Kyudo is growing because we see that internationally we're adding numbers, but like 10 people in Ecuador, 20 people here are really nothing in comparison to the Kyudo community in Japan. And the Kyudo community in Japan is diminishing, is reducing itself. And more importantly, it might be increasing, but in the levels of high school and university. But in grown-up adults, practicing Kyudo is going lower and lower. So yeah, there is a situation where if Kyudo practice continues this way, the population is going to be reduced in such a way that, for example, the kake makers, the yumi makers, and the artisans for the equipment that is the better quality equipment, not directed for high school and university, they're going to start becoming less and less. And some sensei in Japan are aware of this. So I think that they do find the fact that many foreigners are trying to go to Japan and learn as something that's kind of like refreshing for them. That might be the clue to avoid the extinction of the practice.
Yeah, I think that this aspect of wanting to learn and asking questions and showing that you can think for yourself is such an important part of our practice. Like you can redo it. What was it? You can repeat the same thing over and over again, but if you're doing the same thing, what was that quote? If you always do what you always done, you always get what you've always got. So and I think that's something that is true even in the West. Maybe it's not in the Budo because most of us come with this, we already know it's different. So we're already trying to explore something that's different and ask questions and stuff. But even in our day-to-day lives, whether we're driving our cars or going to work here, we have to be aware that having this curiosity is really important. Sticking with the Japan theme, do you have another story you want to share about your time there that's interesting? Yeah.
Oh wow, there's way too many, but I think that maybe one of the and maybe this will relate to what we might talk next time. There were a couple situations that were mind blowing for me. Like there's a couple of experiences that. I really have really stayed in my mind. And for example, one of these, before that, yeah, there's a huge experience that I can talk to you about. And is that actually I was in Sendai when that great Tohoku earthquake happened, the earthquake and tsunami. So yeah, I think that I'm going to tell you more about that than my strong impressions, because this I think is very relevant. I was finishing my master's degree when the earthquake happened, and I was actually in the laboratory. I was with a furnace, doing some experiments at 2,000 degrees, burning some chemicals at 2,000 degrees, and the earthquake happened. And well, that was quite an experience, let me tell you. Very scary, but in all, I was very thankful that if I had to go through such a huge calamity, I was very thankful that it happened in Japan. It was a catastrophe, but the response was so incredibly efficient, that it was like, at the same time that this terrible thing was happening, it was very inspiring to see how people reacted to it, I think that, for example, if something like that would happen in Ecuador, there would be no reconstruction. You know, it would be a matter of closing the door and throwing away the keys. You know, it's like, yeah, we're done for. But in Sendai, it was incredible how people reacted. One of the things I remember the most from that experience is going back home a little bit after the earthquake. It was already dark. It was snowing. It was very cold. The floor was frozen. There was no light, no telephone, no internet, nothing. You know, just the earthquake just happened. And as I was going home, I saw how in the conveni, the people were lining up outside the conveni, and they were very organized, like taking one bottle of drink, one snack, and one other food. You know, and everybody followed this rule. You know, nobody took more than they needed for that moment. And the people were there was no cashier, and the people were leaving the money and taking their 3 items. And nobody was coordinating this. This happened spontaneously. And this was one of the most impressive things I experienced in my life, you know, that in this, in the heat of the moment, many people still didn't have contact with their families. You know, you didn't know what was going on. And even under those situations, people were standing in line, being respectful and considerate for others, and taking just what they need and leaving the money in a little box, you know, so it will be gathered later. It was incredible, really.
Yeah. So what happened in those next couple of days? How did you manage to even, with no power and no water?
Well, wow. For example, I can tell you one of the things that we had to do. It was like a pack of wolves looking for energy, the students, you know. So we went around the town in bikes, trying to look for. We needed to charge our cell phones. So, for example, we found that some of the vending machines actually have like a battery in them, and you can actually plug in stuff. So we had to drive, you know, go in groups and try to locate these vending machines and tell each other. Then we will find somewhere where they had like bottled water, like we would get, or, you know, it was just trying to communicate with all the other students and trying to explore what was going on, where we had like certain things available, and then go back to the headquarters, let's say, and then tell everybody, come on, let's go here. And yeah, it was during 2 or 3 days, it was really precarious, you know, no light, no internet, no water, no gas, nothing. And it took a while. I think it took almost 24 hours for me to communicate with my family here in Ecuador. And yeah, it was very, very scary. And another one of the very shocking things I remember from that time is that night, the night of the earthquake, we didn't know there was a tsunami. So, you know, we're in Sendai and we don't know about Fukushima. We don't know about anything. We just know that there was a huge earthquake and we didn't know anything else. And we went with a group of friends to the highest mountain in our neighborhood. And you can actually see like very far away the sea. And that night, there was a line of fire tracing the shape of the coastline, you know, and we were like, what the hell is going on? We didn't know anything about a tsunami by that time. You know, it's impossible, no communication. And we were like, this is so strange. And the next morning, you know, that night we slept in a school, in like a refuge. And the next morning I woke up and opened a newspaper, and then there was like this huge two-sided print of the Sendai airport completely destroyed by the tsunami. And then I found out, you know, like maybe, you know, the day after I knew about the tsunami, and then we could relate that what we were looking in the coastline was actually the destruction of the tsunami and all the fires that it caused. And then the Fukushima thing started, and well, that was a crazy adventure. I can only tell you that in order for me, I was a little bit forced to come back to Ecuador. I didn't want to come back to Ecuador. You know, like many people fled Sendai when the earthquake happened. But I was one of those people that were like, no, I'm not leaving. You know, I feel like I want to be part of this place, so I'm not leaving. But I was a little bit forced to come back. There was like a diplomatic strategy I was played upon that the authorities in my country kind of forced me to come back to report that I'm alive, and then I come back to Japan. But, you know, in order for me to go back to Ecuador, I had to basically take a taxi from Sendai to Osaka. But it's much more complicated. It took 3 days, and it was like it was something like maybe like a zombie movie or a zombie apocalypse movie kind of 3 days. But yeah, it was quite an adventure that. But all in all, something that is interesting is that many people, they will be like, "Oh, you will be like very scared or traumatized or how you want to go back to Japan? There's still earthquakes and the Fukushima thing going on. Why don't you stay in Ecuador?" And I was like, "No way. If something like this is gonna happen, I want to be in Japan when it happens." So even though it was a very traumatic experience, like such a disaster, I was very impressed by the positive way Japan responded. So I was not afraid after that. I was like, I feel super safe in Japan. So I was not.
Yeah, good for you. We, on the other hand, we were planning on being in Japan in July that year, and there was still kind of fluctuating talk on how far the radiation would go. So we just postponed our trip for another year. But yeah, that was a crazy time. I can't believe you were there when that happened.
Wow, yeah, definitely, and it was very, very incredible, and and not only that time, because sometimes you think that the big earthquake is scary, but then there were big earthquakes every day for like 6 months. Like a 7 magnitude earthquake was like everyday stuff. You will get 2 or 3 of those, and only one of them are like big news in other places, but then you will have like 2 or 3 for like 3 or 4 months every day. Yeah, so it was a very impressive time, like a very exciting and scary time to be in Sendai.
Yeah, talk about just knowing that it'll come sometime, but not knowing when and where you'll be. Like you could be on the toilet for all, and things are just shaking. Man, wow.
Yeah, and just let me tell you one thing. Like a couple days before the big earthquake, there was already like a 7-something earthquake. That was kind of a little bit rougher than usual. And I happened to actually like to write in my Facebook, like, this earthquake that happened today, many people think is related to the big earthquake that is a cyclical earthquake that happens every 40, 50 years. And many people, they think that the probability for the big earthquake to happen in the next month is like 80% or something like that. And 2 days later, the big earthquake came. So, I think that there were a little bit of signs of this, like I saw some interviews about people talking about it, but we never expected that it was going to be like a couple days later. So yeah, very, very scary. Yeah, and you could be anywhere. You could have been anywhere,
Crazy. Well, it's glad that none of your friends got severely injured or anyone you knew was hurt in that situation.
So last time we talked about, I was telling you that I had an early interest in Japanese pop culture, basically, through video games and also like anime and origami. And, that at the beginning, my access to these games, because it's Ecuador and the things are not very available since always, I had to find like these contraband games, which were in Japanese. And that was like the first time I really wanted to learn Japanese. Because, for example, I remember playing Final Fantasy, which is a very difficult game and you have to read a lot of text. But I only had access to a Japanese version. So my way to be able to, with 10 years old, to be able to finish this game was just trying to write the words that were written in different colors and then trying to match them, okay, this word seems to be important. So let's try to see if this word is a town, is a character, is a whatever. And that's how I was able to finish the game completely in Japanese without knowing anything, right? And then I was like, I need to learn Japanese since I was a kid. But that opportunity was not available for me until much later, because here in Ecuador, we didn't have Japanese schools really for a long time until kind of recently. So that was a little bit of my first interest. But it really took off when I got into the university. And then when I entered the San Francisco University, it's a very liberal arts based university. So I had the chance to take courses on Oriental philosophy and practices, for example, the history and spread of Buddhism throughout Asia. Then I started taking Japanese language classes, Chinese calligraphy as well. And all of this while taking chemical engineering classes. So that's something I really like about this university, that even an engineer has a chance and has to take some of these classes. And it's also in the university where I really discovered and started practicing Budo in the form of Kendo, maybe some 16 years ago. And then also something I'm not sure I mentioned this last time, but in my junior year, that's the third year, right? A junior, I think, in the university.
We use a different terms. We don't have junior, freshman, senior, that kind of stuff. It's just year 1, year 2, year 3.
Oh, right. I think it might be junior kind of career. I actually went to study in the US. I was there for a year in the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where I went with a scholarship for engineering, but as always, I used these opportunities also to take Japanese classes and Kendo as well. And of course, a lot of engineering. It was really hard to study in that university. And once I finished the university, I came back to Ecuador and finished my chemical engineering career. And then I started working as a process design engineer. And during this time, I was working for about 2 years. And during this time, I kept on studying Japanese by myself. Every day I had to go to work in the bus. So I was like, and in Ecuador, going in the bus means like basically going in a very crowded space, holding like this with many, many people around you. Many of them pickpockets, but still I managed to study Japanese every day in the bus. I carried the big book trying to learn by myself. And also during this time, I was training martial arts a lot, even though I was working full time. I was practicing Kendo maybe 3 or 4 times a week, Aikido as well 2 times a week, Karate also 2 times a week, and also had some practice with Jodo and Yaido while I was working. And also during this period when I was working, I also studied a lot of Zen and practiced Zen very intensely. So basically I had martial arts, work, martial arts, and that was my everyday for like 2 years. So it was a period of my life that I look back and I'm like, it would be impossible for me to keep that rhythm again. But that happened for some time. And that was okay until I kind of grew disappointed with my job. And the problem is that the nature of my job as a chemical engineer is to, at least in this work, was to design the petroleum extraction and refinery facilities. And the thing is that our petroleum here in Ecuador is in the Amazon jungle. So that meant that all the things that I was designing and everything were built in the Amazon jungle. And although I had a lot of care to follow the environmental norms and all that, the moment where the constructor has to start the project, they start cutting off expenses and they start failing to do these important things for the environment. And then part of my job required me to go to the built places, to the facilities, and verify that what I planned was what was built. And unfortunately, this was not the case most of the times. So there was this problem where, I had to approve some projects that were not following environmental rules strictly. So I had this problem and I just decided to, give my back to the industry completely and try to do the complete opposite thing, which was to study environmental remediation or something like that. So there's where I started looking for opportunities to study. And I learned of a scholarship in Japan just by reading the newspaper, as like a serendipity, you might say. And I was like, wow, yeah, excellent. This is a great opportunity. I had been learning Japanese, so I thought I had good chances to apply for this scholarship. And thus, I applied and was selected for the scholarship, thankfully. So I asked to be accepted into Tohoku University. And I was telling you that the decision to go to Tohoku University in Sendai was in part based because of the influence of the Herigel book, right? I thought that, it would be awesome to go and learn Kyudo. At that time, I had never really seen Kyudo with my own eyes. it was like an idea to go to Japan and continue my Kendo practice, which was my main martial art at that moment, and also learn something that was not available in Ecuador. Although it has been available in South America, it has been very small until now. I think Kyudo is very young outside Japan anywhere. So I had the illusion to go and practice Kyudo. And I thought that going to the place where the events of this book took place would be like an awesome idea. But, it was not a Kyudo powerhouse I was expecting, really. However, going to Sendai was a great opportunity, and it was a great decision, and I'll let you know why in a little bit. And also, of course, the university, Tohoku University, is one of the best universities in Japan. Right now, it is the best university in Japan. So also from my academic perspective, it was a great decision. And the laboratory to which I belonged was really, really great. So I had no regrets in my choice, in my decision to go into Sendai. So I was there for about 6 years, during which I studied my master's and my PhD in environmental sciences in the chemistry of recycling. And also I practice a lot of martial arts. As I was telling you, sometimes I feel like I put too much emphasis in the martial arts and not in the academic aspect. So I was training like Kendo some 2 or 3 times a week, and Kyudo a lot more, maybe 12 hours at least every week of Kyudo. And it was great. In Kendo, I could train with Hachidan, with a few Hachidan in Sendai, with, for example, Endo Sensei, who's the Shihan of Tohoku University Kendo Club, and Sone Sensei as well. And in Kyudo, I had a lot of teachers in Kyudo. The main teachers were Takeuchi Sensei, who many people know from the One Shot, One Life documentaries. And another of my main teachers was also Matsubara Sensei. And I told you a little bit about them last time. Takeuchi Sensei is very conservative. You can see this in the documentary, he's like what we would expect of a Kyudo teacher. I think that he's very, I wouldn't say stereotypical, more kind of like archetypical Kyudo teacher kind of thing. And in the other hand, Matsubara Sensei was a little bit more, how would you say, more liberal, perhaps. These terms are not quite precise, but he was a little bit more experimental in his approach to Kyudo. And also, one of the things that was great of living in Sendai was that I didn't spend much money. In my costs for living and transportation were very low in comparison to people who live in Tokyo or Osaka. So this means that with Sendai as headquarters, it was very easy for me to travel to many places. So I had the chance to go around and go to seminars and travel a lot while I was living in Japan. And also something I mentioned a little bit last time is that there are not many foreigner practitioners of Budo in Sendai. Although there are many international students, there are not many Budo, people interested in Budo. But I had a very close friends, international friends, Budo friends, and it was great to travel with them to seminars. For example, in Kendo, Brian Beckford from the US, he does Kendo and Iaido as well, and also Thiago Junqueira from Brazil. Those were my Kendo buddies. And also in Kyudo, for example, Kentaro from Poland, he was also a very close friend in the Kyudo in Sendai. And with them, I tried to travel and go to seminars as much as possible. And some of these seminars, I'm sure you know, like the International Budo Culture Seminar in the Budo University, in Katsura, near the Budo University, or the Oceania seminars for Kyudo, and also for Kendo, the Kendo World Keikokai. Those are also great. I really like them. And I was very excited to go to the Kendo World Keikokai because for a long time I had admired Alex Bennett. I really liked the idea of him being able to have an academic position regarding Budo and his work as a translator. I really, really admire that. So I was very happy to meet him under these circumstances. And then actually, I got to know Alex a little bit better and actually work with him because we worked together in the Budo documentaries. He was a narrator in the documentary series, so we had to do some work together in that. So that was great. So also I told you about the Camito family, which was very important for me. I was kind of adopted by this family, especially by Mr. Camito. And really, I owe him all the development I could do in Kyudo. I owe it completely to him. You know, he taught me everything, and he took me to the places. He always let me know what was going on in the Kyudo community. So really, I owe him a lot of thanks. And also, not only in the Kyudo aspect, but also in the Japanese family life, and also in the Japanese language, especially in the local, how do you call this? In the local, what's the right word? Local parlance, I guess you would say, like the local slang and stuff. So that allowed me to really be able to communicate with the people of Sendai, you know, in a better language than just the normal standard Japanese. So that was like a lot of insight into the Japanese family through the Camito family. And I was also telling you that Camito-san is a very unusual person. He combines some aspects of very, very traditional and strict Japanese culture with some very, very liberal global aspects joining the same person. So yeah, he's an incredible person, really.
And he was the guy that you said backpacked all around the world.
Yeah, exactly. So it's very interesting. Like when you hear about his youth and his experiences when he was young, you know, you hear these things like, wow, who would do that? You know, like go as a backpacker to Nepal, but never going to Nepal, you know, without information. He just went to the places for without a time limit. So he just traveled where his life took him, you know, for a long time. So that developed in him a very interesting personality. But if you look at him in Japan, you would think that he's like the most conservative Japanese man you've ever met. You know, as soon as he gets inside his house, he changes his Occidental clothing to yukata or kimono, and that's how he feels better, you know. And he's like the man of the family. He gets first to the afuro and all this stuff. But at the same time, you know, it's a very strange contraposition. So yeah, it was great to meet him, like a person like that as well. And what else? Also, I told you about my experience with the documentary films, Empty Mind films, that you know, it was a lot of work. It required the organization part, approaching the institutions, convincing them, preparing questions, and then the part of executing the interviews, and then preparing the translations, doing the subtitles. All this stuff was a lot of work. But you know, working with the director John Braley, it really was a great experience. You know, I think that he does his job very well. For example, one of the things that impressed me is that how he managed to construct the One Shot, One Life, the Kyudo documentary. At the beginning, I didn't really understand what he was doing because it was kind of too Western for my liking, you know. But when he finished it, and the music and everything, it was actually like, then I could really appreciate a little bit of the genius behind his concept. And I really liked working with him. It was very hard too, you know. He's a person that is very hard to work with, but if you manage to match his pace, it's a very great experience. You know, sometimes he was too absorbed in his job, so a part of my job was kind of taking care of him somehow. You know, like don't stop here, or you know, move a little bit here, or when he forgot to ask or say thank you to somebody, like I had to like, yeah, he meant to say thank you or whatever. So it was a little bit like also trying to allow him to be able to do his work. So that was great. And the best part of this, of course, was meeting the people and going to the places where we filmed. So for example, in karate, I met some really interesting people like Higaona sensei from Okinawa, from Goju-ryu, and also Sensei Naka Mori from JKA, Yahara Sensei from Karate no Michi, Otsuka Sensei from Wado-ryu. So, you know, I never thought I was going to be able to meet all these people. And also in Aikido, I had the chance to meet and talk to Doshu to Moriteru Ueshiba, as well as Mitsuteru Ueshiba, visit the Iwama branch dojo, also like some very important Aikido sensei like Chino Susumu and Ando Tsuneo, some of the pupils of Shioda Goson sensei. So that was also great, and so much more. One of my favorite episodes doing the documentaries is when we went to visit the Iwama dojo, and we met a lot of the pupils of Ueshiba sensei, and also some of the uchideshi that were working there. And after the interviews, we got some sake together. They have their own Aikido sake, this brand of sake. And it was very nice to talk to them about metaphysics of martial arts until, Doshu announced that he was going to the dojo before everyone expected. So then we had to run away before he caught us. So it was really funny, the pupils of Ueshiba sensei, they are all very old guys now. But we were all trying to run away like children, hiding away from Doshu, who was coming to the place without previously telling us, and everybody was a little bit too drunk to handle the situation. So that was kind of funny, and so on. So these kind of situations were really great during the documentaries series. And also in Kendo, some of the things that one of the things I really liked from the filming was meeting some really cool sensei. For example, Osawa sensei, he's the author of a very famous book on Kendo. And also Inoue sensei, he was also a very important sensei. I really appreciated his perspective on Kendo Kata, for example. And also some interesting sensei like Uki Terukuni sensei, who is the sensei who practices the Ichiken Gai, it's like pre-war Kendo. So it was also great to be able to meet him. And actually after the filming, I went to train with him a few times to Tokyo. And it was great to be able to also practice some pre-war Kendo, things where you will be able to do Yoko Men and foot sliding and this kind of stuff. And so on, Then we also filmed Jukendo, Tankendo, Naginata, Judo, and Shorinji Kempo. Shorinji Kempo was a very interesting experience to go to the headquarters. And that in itself could be just a very long story, Shorinji Kempo, it was, how could you say, it was a very interesting experience. And it was also a little bit terrifying experience. But Shorinji Kempo.
Say something about that. Say something about that.
So I thought that Shorinji Kempo, I think it's awesome. I really like the idea of martial arts plus the ethical aspect and part of the meditation, like Shaolin. But there is also a kind of a social and political dimension to Shorinji Kempo that is a little bit strange. So, at the same time that I was very interested and I felt very welcome when I visited the Shorinji Kempo headquarters, at the same time, you also feel a little bit watched and constrained. It's kind of like a strange situation. It's like the walls have eyes kind of thing. And also you had to be very careful with what you said, what you filmed. So it was all, how do you say? In comparison to other martial arts, for example, the Kendo and Kyudo in particular, which are so open. I really like these institutions, they are, this is us, film whatever you want. Some other Budo are very, very secretive, just like a little detail. I'm going to tell one of the things that were strange from Shorinji Kempo. We spent 3 days in the headquarters filming these amazing Embu expositions of the highest, technical aspects of Shorinji Kempo. And well, when John was doing the editing for the documentary, they asked him to not include any at all scenes of fighting. So this is how can you do a martial arts documentary without any martial arts? So, this kind of things, and they have their reasons, because, I think that Shorinji Kempo is somehow transforming from a martial arts thing to a more a social force. So, this kind of thing was a little bit, interesting but scary at the same time. The amount of control they expect to have over the exposition of their martial art. So yeah, that was a little bit interesting, but still really, really great to visit the headquarters. What else? And also, for example, well, and Kyudo, of course, the documentary of Kyudo is amazing. And one thing I think it's important to mention about the Kyudo documentary is that I feel that when the documentary was released, that was maybe some 10 years ago, maybe a little bit less, 8-10 years ago, I think that there was still a lot of discussion regarding what is Kyudo. And then we had like some bands like Kyudo is Zen and Kyudo is philosophy, Kyudo is martial, like all these very stiff positions. But I think that the One Shot One Life documentary has the merit to show Kyudo in all these aspects, and say that all of this is Kyudo. It's not like either one of them is correct and the other ones are not, but Kyudo is all of this. There's a Kyudo, is something when you're at a school level. Kyudo is something when you're in university level. When you are an adult, it has different dimensions. For some people, it's just a space for social interaction. For some people, it's a space for personal development. Some people like the competitive aspect. Some people just want the Shinsa aspect, for example. And I really think that the documentary managed to show this all together, and how all of these matches instead of compete. It's not like one Kyudo, but Kyudo is a very diverse practice. So I think that was great from the documentary. I really think that I feel that it has helped to change a little bit the perspective of accepting more different kinds of practice within a single discipline. So what else I can tell you? Trying to get to the point where we left last time. So another experience I think it's worth mentioning during the time as I was in Japan was participating in the 16th World Kendo Championship that was held in the Nihon Budokan. Participating in itself, it was great, like being able to fight in the Nihon Budokan, incredible, it's like a dream come true. But more than that, I really like the experience of the Ecuadorian Kendo team coming to Japan. It was the first time for most of them. And we traveled to Oita in Kyushu to train before we went to Tokyo. And it was great because I had the job to be the interpreter for everybody. So I had to be in every interaction there was between an Ecuadorian and a Japanese sensei, I was in between. So, of course, I was very busy, but at the same time, I had access to everything that was being communicated. And that's one of the great things of being a translator or an interpreter. You are the only person who really has access to absolutely everything that is being communicated. So I really like that. To be able to have the experience and actually to have my skills in Japanese to serve a purpose. So that was great. I really enjoyed, being of service for the Ecuadorian Kendo team, and just looking at my friends in Ecuador. Many of them I had trained for a long time, but then when I went to Japan, I didn't see them for a long time, and meeting them again in Japan was really incredible. So that was very, very nice. And also, where we left off a little bit, another interesting thing that happened during my time in Japan was that I was in the epicenter of the great Tohoku earthquake in 2011. So I'm going to make very long story very short. The most terrifying thing, something I remember last time we were talking, I was in a taxi across Japan. So the thing is that the most terrifying thing during the earthquake was actually a cultural shock with Ecuador. So, this is strange, what about a culture shock, Ecuadorian culture shock in Japan in the earthquake? So what happened is that I had to deal with the Ecuadorian embassy in Japan, okay? And what happened is that was the worst part. Dealing with the Ecuadorian government and with the Ecuadorian embassy in Japan was the most terrifying and most difficult part of the entire tsunami and Fukushima, everything experience. And the reason is because at that moment, I had to deal with many of the aspects that make Ecuador remain an underdeveloped country, you know. For example, I'll tell you an example. When I tried to contact the embassy to ask for help, you know, like give me information or help me move, or, you know, like what's going on, some assistance, they told me, you know, you're so selfish. You are in no situation to be asking for help. You know, there's people that are in so much worse situation. And they told me that they couldn't, you know, take care of me in any way or help me in any way because they already had too much work repatriating 3 dead Ecuadorians. You know, and this one, oh man, I was like, yeah, okay, if there's people who died, it must be terrible. But this is the point. No Ecuadorians died. You know, they were saying that 3 people from Ecuador had died during the earthquake and tsunami, but there was absolutely no Ecuadorians dead in this. What happened is that they didn't even have a register of Ecuadorians in Japan or where they were or anything. So they decided that 3 people that they thought were in Sendai were dead. And they actually called the families in Ecuador and they say, you know, there was an earthquake and we think that this person died. And the families were like terrified, you know, like, oh my God, earthquake, Japan, dead. These people, one of the people that they reported death to the family was not living in Japan for over 11 years. And they called the family to tell them that, you know, that person died in Japan. It's like, and of course it was a great confusion. But what was going on, and this is the terrible part, you know, is that the embassy was trying to make use of some emergency funding for themselves. So that was the whole scheme. And they were, every time I tried to call, they just told me like, no, there's people dead and don't bother, you know. We're dealing with so many problems. You are not a problem. And I was the only person who actually needed help in that moment. I was the only Ecuadorian or one of 2 Ecuadorians who were in the entire region when that happened, you know. But still, they were refusing to help me in order to access this fund. So this was one of these things of very deep corruption, you know, that I had to deal with. So in the end, I was doing my intelligence work by myself. And then I found out that it was not true that there were any dead Ecuadorians or anything. And I talked to them, you know, like, okay, you know, oh, and other thing that happened, I got a call from Ecuador, from I don't remember where, from immigration office or something. And they told me, you know, this problem in Japan, it's making also problems here. And we need to prove that you are fine and safe. So you need to come back to Ecuador. And I was like, I don't want to go back to Ecuador. And they were like, you have to go back to Ecuador. If you don't come back to Ecuador and make this easy for us, we're going to put some blockings so that you are never going to be able to get a visa to Japan or something. You know, they threatened me in this situation because trying to make good publicity for the government, you know? So it was really terrible. But to make it very short, I learned that they were lying. And I told them, you know, you're forcing me to go back to Ecuador. They threatened me. So at least pay for me, you know, use the emergency fund that you have and pay. And they were like, you know, we cannot help you because it's like personal travel expenses. And they said, we can only help you for the internal travel in Japan, not for the international travel. So I was like, okay, so this is how we're going to play. So they had this scheme. So they wouldn't let me use the money for the emergency to try to keep it for the sale. It's so incredibly, how do you say, I cannot believe it when I remember these things. But that's how it works, you know, that's what was going on. So to make the story short, I said, okay, you're not going to pay for my flight, no problem. Just make a compromise to pay my terrain transportation within Japan. So please send me a letter with a compromise of payment to the person that's going to transport me. So they thought I was going to take like a cab to the train station and, you know, it was going to be like very cheap. But, you know, I counter-schemed their scheme and I took a cab and I took some people with me and we went from Sendai to Niigata across because we couldn't go through Tokyo, you know. I had to go to Osaka in order to get out of Japan at the time. You know, it was very hard at that moment. So, and it was impossible to go through Tokyo, impossible. And one of the reasons is that there was no gasoline at that point. You know, if you wanted to go from Sendai to Tokyo by car, one of the problems is that there was not enough gasoline to do it. It was not possible to do it. So we went the other way, from behind the other side of the island, and took a cab, Toyama and all these places, and then went to Osaka. And I can only tell you that they were probably very surprised by the really high fee of this, but it was a very interesting road trip. You are kind of like escaping Japan in the confusion of the earthquake, and I'm trying to get to Osaka. And well, in the end, I could outplay, the embassy, and they ended up paying thousands of dollars in a taxi. In comparison to the plane ticket, it was like 4 or 5 times more expensive than the plane ticket. So I could get away with that. And eventually, I took actions against that, and actually many people from the embassy lost their jobs, and their positions because of what they did. So yes, definitely the worst part of my experience in the Japanese earthquake was dealing with this kind of like unfortunate corruption that is very widespread in Ecuador, and I think in South America in general. But eventually, all that happened, In the other hand, as I was telling you, I was very, very happy, well, not happy, but I was very pleasantly surprised with the reaction of the Japanese people to this catastrophe. I think that it was amazing, the solidarity and the resilience that the Japanese people showed to this. It was really incredible. Really, really. When I think about it, it seems impossible, because I cannot imagine people being so kind to others, given their own personal tragedy, But that was like the spirit of the people after the earthquake. Regarding, how the government managed certain things, I might not agree with that in some things, but the normal people, like the common people, it was very surprising how well they responded to everything. So that was kind of a little bit where we left off. And now maybe I can tell you what happened after I came, back to Ecuador, and how it was coming back to Ecuador, right? So another important thing regarding, finishing my time in Japan was also taking the Japanese examination, the JLPT. And, that's also an interesting story, because many times people who study Japanese have the JLPT exams, to mark their progress. But I never took a JLPT exam until I took the level 1 exam. And that was just a couple weeks before I left Japan. So I was like, okay, if I'm going to take the JLPT, I better do it now.
Just a quick explanation for those who don't know the JLPT. I think there's 4 levels or something. Could you explain what's required for each one?
Exactly. So the JLPT is the Japanese language proficiency test, and it has 5 levels. N5 is the lowest, and then you keep going until N1, which is the highest. And, it measures your ability a little bit to know the grammar, the words, and the kanjis. It's not very good for speaking or for listening, really, although it does have comprehension and reading comprehension as well. So I think there's a few exams, but I think that the most useful one, the most globally accepted, is the JLPT. So normally people you've been studying Japanese for maybe 6 months, and then you try to go to level 5. But then to go from level 5 to level 4, it's kind of like the double. And then from level 4 to 3 is like kind of the double. So it's kind of an exponential growth. So normally level 1 is, even if you get level 2, it maybe takes a few years to go to level 2, but then going from 2 to 1, it's going to take you like that amount of years again, that's kind of like the idea. But I never went to the trouble of taking the JLPT exams. And before I left Japan, I say, I'm going to try it. I'm just going to try it. I'm going to try the level 1 to see what happens. And then I forgot I registered. I was too busy. And I remember a couple of days before the exam, and I had not studied and I had not prepared at all for the exam. But I went and I took it and I passed it. So that was great. That was really great. I know that many people have the JLPT like a very long-term challenge. And for me, I was very happy that for me, it was kind of like a casual thing to be able to approve it. And I was very happy.
I've heard that there's some native Japanese that struggle with that test as well.
It
Like
might
it's
be,
not that easy.
right. And the thing is that the JLPT level 2, I think is very good because a lot of the content in the exam is useful, so I think level 2 is great. But the problem with level 1 is that most of the new content is pretty useless. It's things that you have to know, but then the chance that you're going to really use them or apply them ever is very, very low. So I think that most of the content in the level 1 exam is really useless. But I think maybe because of the need I had to read in Japanese, for example, in different aspects, for example, in the academic aspect, in the science and engineering in Japanese, and also philosophy and religion and stuff in Japanese, I did have a pretty broad, how would you say, knowledge of grammar and expressions that, so I think that helped me to be able to get through the level 1 exam. Of course, I didn't get like very high grading, but it was great to pass on the first attempt and without studying. So I'm very happy for that. So that was one of the interesting things that I could do before coming back. I was the only non-Asian in the room that day. There were like 250 people taking the exam, and less than half passed. And it was very strange because I was the only person that maybe was not from a kanji culture to start with that passed the exam in that opportunity. So that was very nice. That was like, wow, maybe I can speak Japanese. That raised my self-confidence a little. And the last thing, before coming, after my experience in Japan and coming back to Ecuador, was getting enough equipment in order to be able to begin a group practice, Kyudo practice in Ecuador. So I was very lucky to have, since I practice in different dojo, I had a few friends and people who knew me through Kyudo practice in Sendai, and they were very kind to gather equipment for me so I could take back to Ecuador and start a group. But that was the first part, trying to gather the equipment. The second part was getting the equipment to Ecuador. And that was the beginning of what I still call the worst day of my life, because what happens that the last day I was in Japan, I had to give back my apartment. And then I had to go from Sendai to Tokyo, and from Tokyo to Narita, and then go to Ecuador, right? And the thing is that I was carrying with me 2 huge bags where I had my 2 big luggage. I had a backpack, a computer bag, and a 3-meter long aluminum pipe that weighed like 50 kilograms. And this huge 3-meter long, like thick aluminum pipe was filled with something like around 15 yumi and like a couple hundred arrows and like 10 shinai and like 6 bokuto, and it has some pieces of bogu. Like all my Budo equipment I received in the donation was all stuffed in this huge kind of bazooka-like pipe. And the thing is that I had to go from Sendai to Tokyo in Shinkansen carrying all this by myself. 2 bags, backpack, computer, and pipe by myself. And you can imagine, just how much space I was taking was very, I was very embarrassed. I know I'm taking too much luggage. I'm very sorry. And I was like being like an obstacle in the train, and then transferring from the Shinkansen to the Narita Express inside the Tokyo station, carrying all of this stuff in the summer heat. It was horrible. It was really horrible. So it was like, take 2 bags, return, carry this, return. Every 10 meters, I had to go back and forth like 4 times. It was a nightmare. And then getting this thing on the airplane was another nightmare, like it was excess luggage, it was oversized luggage, it was extra luggage, it was extra costs everywhere. But eventually, all this stuff got to Ecuador. So now in Ecuador, we have a lot of bows. and arrows and yugakes for everybody. But yeah, it took a day that was a nightmare. It was the last day in Japan, carrying all this stuff with the emotional luggage as well, like leaving. So it was really tough. It was really tough. But I think that that's the kind of things that we have to do in order to, to make opportunities for the future, no? So then I had enough equipment and also the permission from my teachers in Sendai to start teaching Kyudo in Ecuador. It was important for me as well to get at least to Yondan before I came back to Ecuador, because my teachers told me this, like, I think they kind of agreed in this, is that if you want to practice Kyudo by yourself and share this in Ecuador, you need to progress at least to Yondan in order for us to be really willing to back up your decision. So that was possible. I actually did get Yondan before coming to Japan. Actually, I even attempted my Godan in Japan as well before coming back. So yeah, that was also important. I had a little bit of pressure from my teachers in order to get to a certain level to get their support. So I could do that, and I got equipment. So that was like the two conditions that were necessary to begin Kyudo practice here in Ecuador. So I came back to Ecuador, and as I was telling you, I think it's a good decision. Staying in Japan is an option, and actually, I feel like I have the option to go to Japan anytime. If I get fed up of Ecuador for some reason, I feel like I have opportunity to go to Japan anytime. Not only because of my family relationships. My wife is Japanese, so I can, we can go to her home anytime. But also because I have professional and also other personal connections that, I think I could make use in order to go back to establish myself in Japan. But for the time being, I really think that it was the best to come back to Ecuador, definitely. Especially regarding martial arts. I think that the biggest decision was, am I going to stay here and keep practicing martial arts that I really love, or go back to Ecuador and kind of refuse access to all these teachers, but in exchange of what? But now that I have been here for a few years, maybe 5 years since I came back from Japan, I definitely think that coming back was the right answer. For my Budo, I think that coming back was the way to actually develop more in Budo, because in certain way, I feel that when you stay in Japan, you are always a little bit infantilized somehow, like you're always going to be the pupil. You're always going to be the younger one. You're always going to be the foreigner, And I think that it's important to actually have a change in these roles in order for you to be able to progress past a certain point. So yeah, I think that that was the right decision, definitely.
Yeah, there's probably that aspect of like everything being so easy and accessible. It's like if you have a baby and you're just spoon feeding them all the time, they're not going to want to pick up a spoon and try to eat themselves. So they don't learn that skill. So yeah. Precisely.
Yeah. So and that's one of the things that, trying to practice Kyudo here in Ecuador and starting to begin a group, it was very tough because the conditions are not very good. Ecuador is a country where I think that the only physical activities or the only practices that are kind of like accepted involve a soccer ball. Like if there's no soccer ball, it's beyond the comprehension of most Ecuadorians, So things like, for example, support from a government or something like that for Budo it's impossible, It's like you can propose social development, personal development, and I think at the end of your presentation, they will just ask, where's the soccer ball? And it's kind of like this. So it's culturally, we are not very used to the idea of martial arts beyond the sports aspect that it might have. So I think that it's very hard to establish something like that.
So one thing we did talk about you carrying all that luggage, almost killed you carrying back to start Kyudo and bring Kyudo to Ecuador, and maybe even help out some of the other Latin American countries. So maybe start with that. Like you're back, you have equipment. How did Kyudo restart, I guess, in your case, or begin in your area, and what have you done so far to help?
Right. So after I came back from Ecuador, I was very lucky because there were already many people who had been interested in learning Kyudo for a long time. All of my Kendo friends, all the Kendo community, I think they were all aware that I was in Japan and I was practicing Kyudo. And many of them already, you know, we talked beforehand, and they were expecting me to come back and share Kyudo with them. So in that sense, it was really, really, really helpful to already have like a martial arts community that was looking forward the chance to practice Kyudo. So that meant that there was already a certain knowledge and of what Kyudo was and some expectations. And also something that was really important is that most people that began to practice Kyudo, they already had experience with other Budo, you know? So actually some of the people I teach Kyudo are actually my Kendo teachers. So it was also a very interesting situation where suddenly your teacher for 15 years becomes somehow your student, you know. But that was a really interesting situation that, you know, still happens, you know. Several of the practitioners we have here are my senses, so that happened. So that meant that by having the equipment and also having like this pre-established conception of what Kyudo was and like the framework of Kendo and the Kendo community, for example, you know, it was not difficult to find people that wanted to practice Kyudo. So the difficult part about coming back and starting to practice Kyudo was very much with the space. And I think that this is a very big problem, you know, especially for Kyudo. 30 meters of whatever in between is not so easy to find in a city, you know. So this means that most of the times we had to find places to practice outside, and this brings a lot of problems. Many people that have only practiced inside dojos, for example, wouldn't even imagine how inconvenient it is to practice Kyudo outside a dojo. You know, you have to deal with stuff like dogs, thieves, police, you know, like what are you doing in this area? You need a permit, and then you ask like, which permit do we need? And they say, oh, you need a permit for weapons. And you say like, but you know, there is no requirement for a permit to practice archery here. And they say, wow, but it's a firearm. We have had these kind of conversations, you know, with the military and the police asking us to present our arm permits for practicing Kyudo, you know, these kind of situations. You know, and they're just trying to harass you. It's power harassment from some authorities. So this is the kind of stuff that you have to deal with, you know. And not only that, you know, in Ecuador, especially in Quito, we have very particular conditions regarding the altitude and the sun. You know, we're right in the equator line, so the sun is very, very strong, and we are like around 250, in some places almost 3,000 meters above sea level. So this means that the weather is very, very hard. You know, in 15 minutes, you can get sunburned. The strong sun can also make you feel bad. We had people fainting and stuff like that. So, you know, it's a very, it's very nice weather, but it's also very powerful and very dangerous. So this one was one of the difficult things, to find a place and deal with all these problems that usually practicing outside here implies. Also, another thing is that there's absolutely no possibility for aid or help from the government. You know, it's like a practice such as Kyudo is nowhere near the priorities of you know what the Ecuadorian government is. You know, if they're gonna do something for an activity, it's probably gonna do with a soccer ball or something like that. You know, it's like a very ball-oriented culture. You know, if there's no ball to run behind, it's not worth as a physical activity kind of attitude. And of course, another problem was the how would you say, certain aspects of how Budo is practiced in a formal setting cannot be really applied when you're practicing under other circumstances. So, for example, one of the big things that we don't do here in Ecuador is the uniform. You know, Because in order for you to have a gi and a hakama, you really need a space to be able to dress like that. So for us, we have to shoot in parks, in forests, in wherever you want, we can. So, the uniform and hakama is definitely not something important to practice under these circumstances. So it was interesting, however, because I did come from a very, how would you say, like a very, of course, very comfortable setting where I practice Kyudo in Japan, to coming back to Ecuador, it was a little bit hard to be able to reconcile how to practice under these different situations. And of course, that required the practice to change. So then there's the difficult part of deciding which things you can change and which things are really not possible to change. So within this, some of the things that we had to change was like the shooting, some procedures, the dress code, and so on. And then it was easier to see which things are really, really fundamental. Like, for example, the shooting technique and the reiki and the courtesy, all of these things are very important. But it's also interesting. It's an interesting exercise because I think that in some countries where some possibilities are easier to access, like I don't know how to call it, maybe more advanced countries or well-founded countries, I would say. Sometimes you can translate the Japanese environment like to another country. You can like import the dojo setting, but in other places we're very far from being able to do that. So yeah, it was a challenge.
There are going to be people here that are listening that understand Kyudo. Could you go into specifics? Like, say someone were to start somewhere, I don't know, out in the woods or in a big field. What are some of the trade-offs that you had to make in terms of what you keep and what you took away?
So, for example, I'll tell you one of my big mistakes. I think consider it a mistake. It was really fun and something, but I think it was one of my first mistakes. I considered that the azuchi was really important. I really thought that it was fundamental to have a dirt wall. So one of the things we first started to do with the first group, because what has happened a long time is that there's like moments where many people group and then it dissolves and a few people stay, and then another wave comes and some people stay. It's something like this. So in the first wave, I was kind of obsessed with the fact that we should have an azuchi. We spent a lot of time trying to build an azuchi in like moving around some dirt in the park. But, it was very hard work. And in the end, it was completely useless because you will build the azuchi, for example, 1 week. And then 1 week later, after children playing and people drinking and couples, being around in the park, there was no azuchi anymore. So it was kind of like a waste of effort and it took a big time. So for example, azuchi, then we started understanding that it really doesn't matter what you're shooting at. Really, it can be just a picture of a mato. It doesn't have to be a wooden mato with paper on the sand wall. It's not necessary. So I think that also not other things that do change a little bit more drastically, and I think that some people noticed before I did, is the fact of, for example, tai hai. How do you do tai hai or something or that serves the purpose of tai hai when you have to practice in the woods? So this requires you to change some things. The first thing is forget about, like sitting and kisa and all the stuff is impossible to do in a park. So you have to do basically standing shooting, risha. And from then, even so, such things like sliding your feet and so on is impossible. You have to, in some places we had to shoot over mud in some situations. So, it's all these details are not possible to implement. But what I do think is fundamental is the archer, the bow. And I think that's basically because it doesn't really matter what you're shooting at, as long as it kind of like has the proper size and it's in the proper distance, I think it's valid. So it has been a process since Kyudo, since I started sharing Kyudo here in Ecuador, about 5-6 years. Okay, 5 years, I think is closer. It's been a process of identifying what's fundamental and what's not. And what's not, just get rid of it because we do have enough problems to try to keep up with what is necessary. So this is one of the one of the big challenges. I think that every place you always have to go through this process. So my recommendation in general, because I think it would be too detailed for depending on each case, but my general recommendation would be, don't fall too much in love with trying to practice Kyudo just as you would in Japan. I don't think it's important to try to do it exactly like that, but it's more important to actually identify what you can bring and what you cannot. And what you cannot, don't worry too much about it. Work with what you can do. And as long as you have both and people, I think that that's pretty much what you need. Yeah. So don't be sad if you cannot have a nice dojo at the beginning. It's not important. Absolutely. And how do you understand it's not important? Because after practicing some time under these situations, I noticed that there was really no loss in Kyudo. These things maybe make a nicer atmosphere. It's easier to have a certain mood, but it's not completely necessary, So that would be like a recommendation. And I think we will talk about that later. Is don't obsess too much in the exterior aspects of the art. The exterior appearance is very circumstantial. So many times, as long as the circumstances don't change, it's not going to happen. So, it's not worth fighting against the current in that sense. That would be my recommendation.
I like how you were saying that there's the person, the bow, and some kind of target. And that's what we're trying to think about. And what, like, one of the terms in Kyudo is like you're piercing yourself because you are the target. So in a lot of ways, it is just the bow and you.
Right. And actually, sorry to interrupt you, but for example, you can practice with the makiwara, and you don't even need the distance, and it really doesn't matter what the target is. And for this reason is that I really, of course, you do need the arrow, of course, but in a certain sense, it's not fundamental, It's more about the act of shooting. It doesn't really matter what you're shooting and what you are shooting at, but the shooting itself. That's why, like, the target and what you're shooting at the target, like big arrows, long arrows, short arrows, doesn't really matter, So it's definitely the human body, and the bow is what I find really, really fundamental.
I can also imagine, like, when you're doing Hasatsu, just the breathing and being in the forest, it must be a very great experience there instead of being like stuck in a gym where a lot of people are.
Well, maybe it sounds a little bit more romantic than it actually is, because you're in the forest and you're trying to figure out if the thieves are coming, or if the dog without a leash is coming to you, or if
that's insane that you have to care about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, that's how would you say that? The country is in the way of development. Yeah, we have to deal with this kind of stuff. That, for example, I'm sure that the Japanese sensei most of them have never encountered such a situation, So this in itself, I think it is a valuable situation, because it also puts you in a set of circumstances which have probably never happened before. So it's also interesting to see, how Kyudo in a certain way can adapt to these new circumstances that have been unthinkable maybe for a long time, or for our teachers.
So any type of dojo, like, you start developing, there's more people coming, and then some people start thinking, hey, let's go check out some international seminars. Let's get some instruction from like Japanese senseis. When that started coming up, what was the situation like, and how did you help prepare them for going to such things?
Well, right. Actually, that is still happening now. So what happened in a certain way is that when I came back, we started practicing Kyudo. And at the beginning, there was not a real system. It was basically me and some people with experience, especially in Kendo, but no real experience in Kyudo. So it was just one teacher for many students. And that was a problem as well, because it's also a general advice. When you're starting something, starting a group or anything, do it as small as possible, because it needs to be like an organic growth. So if you have only one teacher, one instructor, you need very few people as to make like the first generation of what would be like senpai. And once you have the senpai, you can get more people, because then the teaching, some things you can ask your senpai to teach, and other things you have to teach yourself. But if you start making this structure, like the teacher teaches the senpai, and the senpai help a lot teaching the newcomers, and that way you can have this organic growth. So at the beginning, I think a mistake is like being too enthusiastic with the idea of having as many people as possible join you. So I think that another advice would be like to keep that, it will take time. And I think also in my case, it happened that we tried to, let's make this Kyudo and let everybody do Kyudo, but it's not such a good idea. It actually takes time. And I think that it took until now, maybe around 5 years, until now there's a group of practitioners that are in the capability of actually teaching the fundamentals to other people. So the thing is that until this, let's say this first generation of senpai in Ecuador was training to become so, we were very quiet. So actually, Kyudo in Ecuador was kind of like a secret thing until very, very recently. I think that maybe since the year before the pandemic was really when we were like, going out and also like attending to seminars and stuff. It had been like basically me going to seminars in Japan and then nothing. And now, for example, the first approach I did, and I did it unfortunately just by myself, was, for example, going to South Carolina for the International Kyudo Seminar. That was awesome. That was my first experience going to a Kyudo seminar, not in Japan. So that was very, very cool. But unfortunately, the other practitioners from Ecuador couldn't go. And it was not, by that time, they're ready, and I think that they're ready for examinations and everything. But the other problem we have to deal with in Ecuador is that basically our economies are not very good. So most practitioners, they don't have the economic potential to travel and attend seminars or get their own equipment, really. So that's also a big limitation. However, after I went to the US in 2019 to the South Carolina seminar, everybody, like the senpais, are all looking forward to that. Like they took that as a that experience, which was very good. I really enjoyed it. I cannot believe how much I enjoyed that seminar, really. Maybe I can tell you more about it later, but they were also very inspired by that. And now they're all trying to save money and to go. But of course, with the pandemic situation, our economy is even worse and traveling restrictions are, it's going to take a while. But this is what I think, you need some time. And in my experience, it's about 5 years until it really makes sense for you to start going with your group to seminars and so on. I think that it's important to have this moment of silence when you are able to develop your own thing under your own circumstances and not be too influenced by the environment, because if we go outside too soon, we're going to want to do things like outside before we really understand what we can do here. So I do think it's necessary a few years, maybe 4 or 5 years of quiet development before it's good to start contacting other groups,
Yeah, that was just like us in Toronto. It was 3 years before anyone went even to attempt a grading, and that was just to the US from Canada. Up until that point, there was no talk about that. It was just like, let's practice in our own space and do things right.
That's very proper, because if you are too eager, like to grow, too eager to make the setting like that, I think that you start getting distracted in emulating the outside instead of like really understanding what you have, like your own circumstances.
It's also a weird comparison, because depending on a dojo, like I know that there's somewhere, if you're doing kendo, you can go for like EQ or shodan in like a year. So everyone's okay, let's practice, let's get into bogu and blah, blah, blah. And yet, like when we started Quito, it was until 3 years in that we even attempted to get shodan. But on the flip side, like Quito, you can, if you're in Japan at least, you can grade like every year, several times a year and blah, blah, blah. While in Kendo, you have to wait like 1 year after Shodan, 2 years after Nidan, 3 years after Sandan, and all that stuff. So it's a very interesting system that you compare.
Yeah, and also, for example, I had always been a Kendo guy, and for me, exams were huge. You wait for a certain time and then you take your grading, and each exam is huge. But yeah, definitely in Japan, when you are able to practice Kyudo in Japan, it's like, yeah, I took 3 exams this year, and you really don't expect to pass them. It's not like like, oh, you only take the examination when you're really sure you're going to pass it, kind of like in Kendo. Like you really, I think that most people, when they take an examination, it's because they think they can pass. But in Kyudo, it's not so much, I think that many times you go to examinations just for the experience of being in the examination. So I think it's more a thing about not this like this great challenge, but it's more like accumulating experience on how to perform well during this challenge. So yeah, definitely, it's really, I like that dynamic, like when you take an exam, you really don't care so much if you pass or you don't, because there will be many chances to do so. And even if you fail, if you want to go to the next dan, yeah, you need just like 6 months or 1 year instead of 3, 4, 5, 6 years in Kendo. So I really enjoy the Kyudo system. I like it.
I think that for both of us in this case, we probably benefit from having experienced both systems, or at least knowing of it, because it just helps balancing out. Like I also love, I like the fact that it's no pressure because you can just keep going. So people aren't thinking, oh, if I fail, then I really failed. It's just another milestone. While I also enjoy like the high pressure system of waiting for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, like for the higher ranks for something, and then going and then seeing if you can. So I think both has like its positives, and I think a lot of people should try experiencing both.
Yeah, definitely. And wow, for Kendo examinations, you really need to have like it really makes you strong, because failing a Kendo exam is terrible. And that's why also like approving an exam is also huge. So yeah, that's also, it's great that is so valuable. Definitely.
So I know that you're not only trying to build up the Ecuador kind of region in terms of Kyudo, you're also trying to help out more of Latin America in general, and actually even posting more stuff on the Kyudo Facebook group to help people around the world. So how are you thinking about using whatever skills and experience you have to spread this art? Right.
Excellent. So I think that the most I learned about, the potential to contribute through translations, a long time ago. Actually, even before I went to Japan, even before I spoke Japanese, I realized that the Latin American or the Spanish-speaking Kendo community, maybe this is like 15 years ago, there weren't many resources. So it was very necessary to translate first from English to Spanish. So I had some activity in Kendo translating from English to Spanish. For example, some articles from Kendo World or Hanshi Says, for example, those articles are great for Kendo, translating some of those to Spanish or from English to Spanish, and also in some seminars, for example. So it was very useful, but of course, even more useful than being able to translate from English to Spanish, which is a skill that is relatively common, I think it was more valuable and more necessary to be able to translate from Japanese to Spanish. And in general, from Japanese to English, I think that there's also there's many people that translate and can translate, but I think it's rather few. And especially when you talk about translating Budo content, I think that the people that can really do it well are even fewer, And so yeah, I really understood, and I saw a need to do that. And of course, there's a motivation to help, but I also understood very quickly that when you are the one translating, or you are the person who's doing the interpretation, there's of course, it's a difficult work, but you're also in a special position, and you're in a special position because you are the single person who is understanding the most. In this interaction, for example, between a sensei in Japanese and the other practitioners in Spanish or in English, when you act as a bridge, you are closer to the sensei than most people. So that makes you be closer to the origin of the knowledge, let's say, which is great. And it also forces you to make this translation between those terms and the terms that you normally speak. So you benefit a lot from translating and from being the interpreter. Nobody is more rewarded by doing that than the interpreter himself. So that's also, I found that it was both a way to really help a lot of people, but it was also a way for me to access the information, as truthfully as possible. So I think that this double motivation is really, really what makes the hard work of translating really possible, like really worth it. So I like that, and I have been trying as much as possible to try to make this bridge of communication between Japanese and Spanish and English. So an example of this is in the One Shot, One Life film. It was, of course, the translation from Japanese to English, which was a massive job. But also, there is a Spanish version of this film. And just as an example, in order to produce a film with subtitles, you have to make like for printing DVDs and stuff, like you have to have a master copy, and creating this master copy from which the DVDs, which are then sold and distributed, are created. It requires like a special cost, like it's a little bit expensive. And just as a show that how important I think it is to translate, actually part of what I would have received as payment for my job in the One Shot, One Life documentary, actually I traded for doing the Spanish translation. So basically, like I paid for the possibility of the Spanish DVD to exist, So, it's kind of like, how would you say, like masochist, because, I'm working for that, and instead of receiving payment, I'm using my payment to work more. But, I really thought it was important to be able to make this movie available also in Spanish.
I hope you got like a producer credit on that, because that's what producers do, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I think. Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like I'm a assistant producer. I think is like the way in which it's described. But yeah, so for example, it's just to show the importance that I find in that, and also I have been translating some articles and interviews and things like that, and also in seminars. Although I have never been in a seminar as a translator or an interpreter, but every time I have the chance, I always try to volunteer to do it. And often, it's always necessary. So I normally I don't propose myself as translator, but I always volunteer myself as translator. And I have always found that it has been necessary, because, in seminars and so on, normally you have very few translators, and unfortunately, many of them are not very good for different reasons. Some people are excellent translators, but when it comes to that Budo context, it's beyond, their possibilities, because there's certain terminology that is used only within this context. And, it would be, you cannot expect somebody that's outside that context to understand. So this has happened, for example, in situations when I have seen like professional translators being hired for seminars. That really doesn't work. It's not a good translation. And the other thing is that even if there are good translators and interpreters, there's too few. Normally you have one of the common problems that I see is when there is like only one interpreter and many people, and then you have to use a microphone, and that doesn't work very well. Normally when the interpreter has to talk through the microphone, it's a mess. It's impossible to understand. The audio is usually not very good, and so on. So, yeah, it's every time I go to a seminar, I remember how important it is, like to try to have people that can translate. Yeah, and about translation, the other thing is that it's so important what you're doing, because basically there's a person who has knowledge, and he's entrusting you to communicate this knowledge to a lot of people. So depending how good you do your work is basically how effectively this communication is being taken from one place to the other, right? So there's a huge responsibility with the translator. And this might be also like a little bit of advice to interpreters and people that would like to act as translators. I think I can provide a couple of points of recommendations. And the first one is that the interpreter is the one who sets the how would you say, the level of maturity of the contents. So what happens often when you're translating from Japanese to another language is that we're in a context where is a great sensei and you're just like a common mortal. So of course there is this pressure to show this gap, like to show courtesy and so on. But the problem is that if you overdo that, you create this distancing between the person speaking and yourself. And that distancing, it's like obstaculizes the information. So if you're, for example, sensei, the thing is that you're going to create a situation when it's a god talking to a educated child kind of thing. So it's a very big difference. And that makes the sensei also feel in a certain way uncomfortable, because he also needs to modify his language, and he also sees that he's talking from a higher position to a very lower position. And that usually doesn't work well. So that's a common mistake I see when people translate from Japanese to other languages. It's an overdoing of the courtesy. It's an overdoing of the humble language. It's an overdoing of the honorific language. And that creates a gap that eventually has a bad effect on the communication. So what I recommend, when you're the interpreter, you have to allow yourself to approach the level of the person you are translating for. So in a certain way, yes, you are a practitioner and you are, whatever. And the sensei is a great person who came from very far and knows a lot of important things and is very respected. But you have to allow yourself to approach him, How I do this, for example, my strategy, I avoid trying to use too much honorific Japanese. I just use it for the first time I meet the sensei, very formal. But then on purpose, I start talking to him in more direct terms, so that our difference in hierarchy and whatever doesn't interrupt. I want to be as close to him as possible so I can better represent what he's saying. So that's my recommendation. Allow yourself to approach the sensei, and that means not overdoing the difference. The best situation is the senseis understand, that you are being you're doing as much as possible to be respectful, but the best thing is to let them feel comfortable with their language. So the best thing is for you to talk the sensei like equals, kind of, in that way, he will be able to feel comfortable, and you will be able to to really subtract as much the valuable information for him in a way that he's comfortable. So that would be my advice. Don't deify the person you are translating for too much. On the contrary, become like equals so that he feels comfortable and gives you more information in a more comfortable way.
So that's a very interesting concept of thinking about being the interpreter in the middle, because sometimes the interpreter might decide that, I'm just here to switch the languages. So it's really the student talking to the instructor, or to the sensei. So then there's this gap that automatically appears. But in this case, the sensei knows that you're just relaying a message. So it's really a conversation between you and the sensei. When you flip that around, how do you make that communication? Does it feel more like it's you communicating to the student, or are you just trying to pass through what the sensei says?
So actually, exactly. The mistake would be for example, deifying the sensei also means for example, taking his literal words and communicating them literally, being afraid to touch it, you're just carrying something very carefully. But I don't think that's the right way. When that happens, when you have these very unsubstantial and very boring translations in the seminars, because it's I've heard this 1,000 times. This is not new information. This man didn't have to come from the other side of the world to tell me this very obvious thing that's written in the first page of the manual, But that's the kind of thing that happens when you just transfer the information directly. So the responsibility also of the translator is to actually do the interpretation of the information. That means to hear what the sensei is saying, understand it, really understand it, and then communicate it in the best method possible. And that's another thing that people don't often do. Sometimes they don't question the person they are translating for. And that's something I also recommend. As I tell you, the level of maturity of the conversation depends on the translator in that sense. As the more different the difference is, in the treatment between him and that, the more unsubstantial it becomes. However, if you get close to the sensei, it becomes more substantial. And then the other thing is that you actually have to pick. You have an important job. You are interpreting because that person has information. So you have to help that person say the information. Sometimes we just say like that sensei is gonna start pouring out the teachings, but no, you need like to push a little bit, and you also have to be able to ask further. For example, if the sensei explains something and you think like, okay, this explanation is not satisfactory, is not enough, is not either I don't understand it or I don't think it's enough explanation. So it's good to clarify, like, sensei, do you mean this or do you mean this? Like, ask. And after you get that clarification, translate. Many people are terrified to ask or question what the sensei says, and then again, you have a non-substantial conversation. But when you press a little bit, you're also telling the sensei, we're a little bit deeper than this level. So that's also a very important role. How much information and the depth of the information you can get is also the responsibility of the translator. So it's, you have a lot of responsibilities. So why is also important? If, for example, somebody asks a question to the sensei and the sensei answers and you just translate the question. If the question is not satisfactory, like is not answered satisfactorily, then it's not going to be clear if the sensei was ambiguous or if you are a bad translator. There's a not very good answer. Whose fault is this? Is it because of the sensei or because of you? So also, I think a recommendation for interpreters is that don't let that happen. If you fear that something is not satisfactory, try to, show that it's not your fault. However, if you just translate directly without pushing forward, then it will be your fault. So that would be also the other thing. Make sure that what is being asked is being answered. And sometimes that requires you to say, sensei, can you please develop a little bit more? Or do you mean this or do you mean that? So in general, you see, I think that my main advice would be like to get yourself to the level of the sensei in order for you to be able to do your work more properly. If you exaggerate in the social distinctions between you, it's going to be a very unsubstantial and boring interpretation.
I want to give you a scenario just for fun and see how you translate. And it's a real scenario, and I've seen it happen many times. So you're at a seminar, and you have in the local area, they have like a 6th dan or maybe even a 7th dan that is like a senior, and everyone knows this and is in front of the large group. And the senior asks the sensei a question, and the response from the sensei, from the Japanese sensei, is, "Are you kidding me? I told this to you 5 minutes ago." How would you translate this to that local senior in front of everyone else?
Well, I would say like, this has been discussed before. Is there any additional information you would like to ask? I think that would be like a very cordial way. And in that way, you are also like transmitting the intention, Yeah, so
yeah,
I think
it's always funny when you hear something like that. Like I understand a little bit, and I'm like, yeah, this person's tone was much worse than what the interpreter like gave. And yeah, and that's a hard spot for an interpreter.
Right. And also, well, another thing is that what is not the job of the interpreter, for example, if sometimes the sensei might have an attitude which is not, maybe he has a special attitude, but also it's not your job to protect or like to round the edges. I think that also one of the things is that you do have to transmit the mood in which it was sold. It's one of the things that you have to translate. And it's one of the things actually that you have noticed in this sense that the senses are saying something in a certain way, in a certain mood, and the translation is like kind of diluted and completely different. So that is also not proper. I think that, for example, if the sensei says something that might be aggressive or maybe like insulting or something that can be like shocking, I think it's necessary to transmit that shock, maybe just making it in a proper form. But I think it's also important to try to transmit the real personality of the sensei. That is part of your job. So sometimes if the things are a little bit rough, I think that you should also transmit that roughness. Sometimes it also happens, again, part of deifying too much the senseis is that even when they make mistakes or they say some things, you try like to filter them, like through your own expectations, but then you are transforming the information in a way that you're not really transmitting what the sensei is saying. You are kind of like curating what he's saying, and that's not the job. The job is to understand is like to understand the words, then get the concept, and that concept is what you translate, the mood, the concept, the feeling, and that's what you then express in your other language. So I think that is also part of that, don't protect the sensei in a certain way.
So we see a lot of like, if you go to seminars, on the regular ones, like on a yearly basis, you see the same translators, interpreters being there, and then they're also practicing. But then there's some people, like in your case, you're trying to do more than just show up there and do the translations. What else are you trying to do with this understanding to share more?
So, for example, the certain things, as I was telling you, the interpreter is the person that benefits the most from any interaction. So, for example, I try also like to be available for people in seminars when they want to have like personal conversations with the sensei as well. Not just like when it's a group, but also like if you want to ask somebody, call me and we go together and we ask. And again, it's part of benefiting people from being able to interact more directly through me. And it's also because all the information that is going from side to side, I have an intimate relation with that information. So, the teaching, I hear it firsthand. And also I can understand what the people asking doesn't understand. So that's also like really, really interesting. So in seminars, one of the things that I also like, and especially in the last seminar I attended in the US, was this, of course, access to the first-hand information, but also to understand what kind of things people ask, because that also shows you like what terms are being used, what is the general understanding of what is being asked. So that's also like very, very, very useful. I remember if I answer your question, I think I got a little bit deviated there.
No. So you started, I think you started with the translating, just doing the official interpretation during the seminar lecture style. There's this peer-to-peer kind of indirect questions that are maybe during social time. And then you're also doing some like translation of materials, like books and something like that.
Talk about? Yeah, so I think that it's really important to translate books. Because one of the reasons, because I think that the literature available to us is very limited. For example, take Kyudo as an example. We have like the first volume of the Kyudo manual, right? But there's other volumes, and they are about the technical aspects and so on. But we only have access to like the first one. So, we refer to it as the book, although it's not really one book. It was never conceived to be one book. It's just one of a series, but we still only have access to the first one of this. So I think it's important to have, access to the other contents, not only the ones that have been officially approved, kind of like for our consumption, but also, a little bit of other complementary works. And I have been working for a long time in translating a couple books, which I consider are really, really important. So the first one of these books is a book which is called The Kyudo Reader, Karasawa Sensei, and it's a really good book because it's one of the few, and among the few, the best, I think, books discussing the biomechanics of shooting. It's from a sensei that had menkyo in many different types of schools, in ceremonial shooting and so on. Like he had like a menkyo or like a hanshi equivalent, like in at least 4 or 5 ryuha. So very, very well-developed kyudoka, I would say. And he analyzes the biomechanics, especially like which muscles are involved and the bones and so on of kyudo. And I think that is something that is really important that we're not having access. So, and I think that's because of the lack of access to this kind of material. The general perception maybe in this side is that that kind of content doesn't exist. Some people, when you talk about the muscles you use in Kyudo, it's that's not Kyudo anymore. It's too specific to be Kyudo. And it's not so. These materials exist in Japan, and they have been produced by very prepared people, like very knowledgeable people. And the fact that we don't have them available doesn't mean that they are not part of Kyudo literature, So this is something I think needs to change, and it's something I think I would like to try to help change through working on translations of that sense. It's not only the spiritual and the nice things that need to be translated, I think that this biomechanical and anatomical Kyudo also is something that we need to introduce a little bit more in our practice. And the other book I have been translating, and I read it once and now I'm translating it as I read it again, is the Book of Four Scrolls. And, you know, this book is incredible because, you know, what's more incredible about the book is not the book itself, because when you read it, it's kind of funny. You know, it's a book which is kind of composed, kind of like a collage. It's like somebody like taking cutouts from different books and articles from the newspaper and pasting them, and that's kind of like the Book of Four Scrolls. So what is really interesting is the choice of those cutouts. You know, many of them are like, for example, legends, some of them are religious texts, some of them are just like, for example, like articles from you would say like a magazine from the time, you know. So it's kind of like, I don't know, any of the magazines you will buy in the airport. Yeah, sometimes there's like the equivalent of such content as well in the book. So it's kind of interesting because it's a book that draws references from many other books. And what is interesting is the choice of those sources. So I'm also translating this book little by little, and especially because I think that normally when you read a book, you try to see you put a lot of importance in the what is written in the book. Okay, so for example, in this book, this is written, but I think that the Book of Four Scrolls is one of the books that is more interesting because of not what is written, but because why that is written. So I'm working in a translation that will also address kind of like trying to explain why those choices were made. And I think I kind of understand, you know, it's not a book that is literal. It's more like a book that, it's more like a reference book of references. So the idea is like how to access those references is more important than just remembering the list of reference in a sense. So that's another book I've been trying to also to translate. And another one, which is not from Japanese, I'm actually also learning a little bit of Sanskrit, and I use this as my Sanskrit practice. I'm also making some commentary on an Indian book it's called the Dhanur Veda, which is part of the Vedas, but it's related to the bow. You know, it's kind of like the art of war. It's called the bow Veda. Dhanur is bow. But it's not only about the bow, although it's a lot about the bow. So the thing is that, you know, translating these works, I realized something that I already suspected from my experience as an interpreter and translating short articles and so on. And it's that the problem of communication, you know, it's not only a problem of language. It's not only that. For example, it is that, but it's not only that. So I do think that it's necessary to keep on working on translation to make resources in Japanese more available. I think that there's a lot of work to do, and I'm willing to do that work as well and try to help as much as possible. But during the process of translating these books and so on, I really understand that even if you translate all the Japanese materials and you make them available in English or Japan or Spanish, there's still gonna be a problem in communication, because there is a problem of Budo communication within Japanese language. And if you translate the Japanese content, you're gonna find these deficiencies like the communication in the languages to which you translate as well. So that make me think about, you know, really what's the problem that needs to be addressed more importantly. And I think that the language barrier is just like an external appearance of this. So what I mean by this, you know, what I mean by this, the real problem is that there is a very inconsistent and very ambiguous language. You know, and of course, Japanese is very ambiguous in itself, but I think that the way of using Japanese in itself, especially in Budo, is very ambiguous. So let me give you a couple of examples. So for you discussing about Kyudo or any other Budo, you can hear expressions like pull from the elbow, right? Or use the back muscles and this kind of stuff. But if you think about it, you can translate this to any language and it's still not going to make any sense at all. because what does it really mean to pull from the elbow? I can say this in any language, but still, what does it really mean to pull from the elbow or use your back muscles and stuff? So I realized that there's too much inconsistency within the Japanese material as to have a really high hope that just translating is going to make communication better. It's probably going to be just as confusing as it is now. So something else needs to be done, something that goes a little bit deeper than just the different languages. And I think that that's where, we can get a little bit into the more philosophical part, if you want.
Okay, let's do it, because I absolutely love to have this conversation. You've already revealed a few things that like normally we don't think about in terms of how you say the interpreter is not just there to pass on information. You also gain a lot. You have to understand what the situation is, what the levels are between people. So that already brings out more to this environment. Additionally, I think that one thing you just passed over, but I want to just remind people, is that when you translate a document that doesn't have an English translation already, you're not just giving knowledge that people didn't have access to, but you're also changing the conversation that people have around that Budo outside of Japan. What I mean is that when something doesn't exist, like how you said, like these physical aspects and these deep thinking, then people start interpreting. They start thinking, hey, there's more to this. We're only giving this. That means but there's more. So I'm just going to come up with my own idea of what it could be and how it should be. And then you can come up with a lot of conflict and arguments around that. And when you reveal that this stuff exists and it's at the same fidelity and level as what you had already, it just changes the way people are able to interact and communicate with the art and with others. And outside of Japan.
Exactly. I completely agree with that. Exactly. And I think that that's a little bit, I think that we will go to that in a few minutes as well. It's completely like that. So I think that exactly the influence that you can have by the choice of translation is huge. It's what, and there's something, and there's a certain, how would you say, there's a certain analysis, there's certain concepts which I have found that are really, really necessary at this point of Budo development outside Japan to start be taken more seriously. There's a certain things that I think need to be discussed a little bit more. And I think that exactly, for example, this is a little bit an attempt to introduce these subjects to the community, so more people can start maybe considering these terms. And exactly, if the terms I kind of propose are not adequate, they're not good, they're going to be judged and they're going to be forgotten in time. However, I think that if there's something good in this proposal, it's something that might, grow and become like something that will have very big changes. And I definitely think that there's a problem in communication, again, in Budo. And I think that the problem is how Budo is communicated and also communication within Budo. So, and what I mean by communication is like transfer of information from one place to another, right? And I think that the way in which we are transferring information or acquiring information through Budo is not very efficient. I think it can be much better. And I have some ideas of how it could be changed for better. I think for many people, Budo is like a crystallized perfection thing. But I think that's not a very adequate way to see it. I think that Budo is better understood as something that is always continually developing. And Budo itself is a process of development. So I think that this tendency to see Budo as an already finished product of the past is not very accurate. And however, I do think that is the main way in which it is understood. And I think it's also at the root of the problem of communication, because we're communicating Budo in a way in which we conceive it to be a finished product. But I think that Budo should better be described, and we should communicate Budo and within Budo more with an idea that it's still in development. And that also makes you thinking about the idea that Budo is not something you just receive as a final product, but it's actually that you can actually participate actively in its development. And that's something I think that it's very necessary for us to change, because as long as we try to just import Budo as it is, it's not gonna be able to cause the positive effect, the potential positive effects it has, rather than if you would like really understand that it's not a finished product, that it's something that can be adapted, learn how to adapt it, and then it can be adapted more efficiently to different environments. And I think that we need to a little bit discuss about this, the malleability of Budo, and how to use that malleability to make Budo adjust better to different circumstances. It's not just us trying to adapt our circumstances to fit Budo. I think that it's the opposite what needs to happen. And both things need to happen, okay? Both processes need to happen, but I think that there's a predominance of only one way and almost nothing of the other. Yeah, so something like that. So
I think it's very important to put it in those words, how you're saying that it's still developing rather than it being some finished product that changes over time. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is, if you're saying that there's something that already exists, like I have a fully fledged apple in my hand, mm-hmm. and depending on current times, oh yeah, we're not in the Middle Ages anymore. We're not using swords. We have guns around. So mm-hmm. let's just change it to what it is today. That feels like too big of a jump, and it's mm-hmm. doesn't stay with this flow. But if you're mm-hmm. saying that it's still growing, and where we are today is you're just nudging in one direction, and then you're nudging into this direction, and like the sun is shining this way, and then water's mm-hmm. coming from this way. So you could see that you're still tied to whatever it was in the past. 10 years mm-hmm. ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago, there's still a connection there. You're not fully jumping, but you mm-hmm. have to allow it to move in whatever direction society is going in.
Exactly. So I think that, and that takes us to the metaphysical part. Okay, so I think that...
Okay, yeah, so you brought up this term earlier. First define what metaphysics means, and then we can go into it.
Okay, so yeah, because I know it's gonna sound very weird, but please, give me a couple minutes to explain myself, and this will start making a little bit more sense. Okay, so let me try explaining for that. Metaphysics. So metaphysics. So meta means beyond or after, posterior to. And physics, we have to understand that physics is in the original meaning of the word, not the modern meaning of the word. Physics now is understood kind of like the science that studies unmutable objects. So you kind of think like there's a sphere in space, and you imagine like this sphere is, a sphere, always a sphere, and you analyze how it behaves in its surrounding and so on. However, the word physics originally meant the study of the nature of mutable objects. So what does this mean? It comes from we could say that modern physics, it's kind of like objects have they don't change, are unchanging. And while the original aspect of physics was always changing objects. So that also, that makes a very clear difference between considering that things exist as they are, or things exist only as they are temporarily. Okay, so that's kind of like what physics means in metaphysics. So when you say metaphysics, is what's beyond the nature of mutable objects. So that means basically why they change and what changes. And that's kind of like what metaphysics would be like. In other words, it would be like what exists and the first causes for the existence of that. Okay, so is sometimes we put metaphysics and we relate it too soon to some other things, which might have a relation. For example, occult stuff and like that do have a relationship, but maybe sometimes we go there too fast. So let's go a little bit slower. So what do metaphysics say? There's many schools of metaphysics. There's Western and Eastern schools of metaphysics, or basically every system of thought has an underlying metaphysics, and every systems of science also has an underlying metaphysics. So there's a lot of different systems. And what most of them agree is that there is only one unique substance, really. Like absolute reality is composed of just one substance. And that's this one substance, it's what is then manifested first as a duality and then as a different composition of different elements. So, so you have some systems that are like dual. For example, this would be like Taoism. You have so one thing that, for example, is how metaphysics are misunderstood. For example, when you see the yin-yang symbol, so you have like the black part and the white part, and normally what we think is, of course, that we have the yin and the yang. But actually, the symbol is not that. It's a symbol of unity because it's illustrating both the yin and the yang as a unity. So, so what's important about the yin-yang symbol is not that there's two principles, is that these two apparently different two principles are really only one. That's the importance of it being a circle that includes these two things. And also another way that we very often, like how our brain processes this symbol, we see black and white and we see, opposing. But in reality, the symbol should, imagine the yin-yang symbol in your mind, right? So now imagine that you're in the white ball edge to the dark area. And then you have the dark ball and the edge to the white area. So imagine that every second they change, like the black edge transforms into white and the white edge transforms into black. So it's kind of like, it's not rotating, it's not a clock. It's not that the white part and the black part moving. The black part is constantly transforming into the white and the white into the black. And at the same time, in the parts of more where the white is clear, you have the production of the other principle, and in the dark parts, you have the production of that. Okay, so then you can imagine this symbol more like the white is dissoluting and transforming into the black and the black into the white. And in the points of maximum blackness, you have a spontaneous production of whiteness. And in the point of maximum whiteness, you have a point of emanation of the blackness. So then you see that you can have this symbol, which is really representing continuous transformation. So it's not saying that it's yin and yang. It's saying that it's a continuous mutation between these two principles. But besides that apparent separation, you have one singularity. So that's what's important about the yin and the yang. It's not their difference. It's they're the single thing. For example, other systems of metaphysics, like the Vedic one, they consider, for example, that there's three elements, basic compositions. So you will have ultimate reality, which will be Brahman, and it's composed of three types of categories of properties, which be tamas, rajas, and sattva. That's kind of like the way in which the different properties of things. So again, the emphasis is not on how these things are different, but that these three apparently different things actually form a single unit. It's just like, it's apparent that they are different, but the reality is that they're a single unity. And for example, you have another expression of this that's very common in the Christian world. You could say, for example, that God is defined as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So that also means, like, which one is God? It's the three of them. It's not either one of them, but the three of them at the same time is God, which has these three manifestations. And also, for example, another way to describe this first metaphysical principle, it's basically saying that there's only one substance that is apparently separated into a diversity of other substances. And for example, another way to describe it is also by the properties, not about what is made of, but what properties this unity has. So for example, in the yin-yang, the way in which it is described is like the great one beyond duality. It's the great ichi beyond duality. It's like how it's conceived. So it's described as being beyond duality. But for example, if you look at Advaita Vedanta, they describe this single substance like Sat Chit Ananda. And Sat Chit Ananda will mean something like true, and true means unchanging. If something changes, it's not true. True means something that is unchanged. Then you have consciousness, Chit, and Ananda, bliss. So you have this description of the single unity. And interestingly, and here I'm going to start landing a little bit to, another one of these sets of propositions to describe the properties of this one single substance in metaphysics is also very famous, and it's called let me see how you call them in English. Oh yeah, it's the transcendentals. And maybe you know them, is Shinsenbi, right? It's the Platonic transcendentals. And many people that practice Kyudo do not know this, but our logo, or our, how do you say, our motto in the Kyudo Federation of Shinsenbi is really a metaphysical concept from Platonic Transcendentals. And it refers that whatever exists, whatever this substance which exists or is, it has three properties, which is Shinsenbi, goodness, beauty, and truthfulness. So that's one first thing that I want to point out. Many of us, we remember Shinsenbi and we really don't know where it comes from. Well, let me tell you, it's actually like a metaphysical concept. And it's very nice because it's a Western philosophy metaphysical concept. So I think that it's very interesting that the International Kyudo Federation proposes these metaphysical concepts, but they are not Japanese concepts, but rather Western philosophy metaphysical concepts. I think that's kind of like I understand a little bit. I think I understand a little bit more the intention. The intention is providing from the Japanese side some metaphysics that are easy to identify for the Western world, but also for the Asian and Japanese world as well. And more importantly, I think that it's kind of an invitation that our expression of metaphysics and maybe the Oriental expression of metaphysics, they might be different in appearance, but in reality, metaphysical theories all are describing the same underlying thing. So it's kind of like the same. You can have apparently different representations of one unique thing. So I think that is very clever, and it's very powerful that this is what is being proposed by the International Kyudo Federation. I think it's kind of like a friendly hand, like through these metaphysical concepts, we can find unity, what we are really doing together, not how we're different, but how we can be together, And I think that that's the purpose of the International Kyudo Federation. We might be different countries, different conditions in every country, but fundamentally we're all together, in this huge structure. Like, we're all part of this. This is what unifies us. Despite our differences, this is what unites us, So I think that's a little bit of the metaphysical hint in that.
I think it's great that, like, so far, everything we're talking about has this second order effect, in that the reason why you were studying something like this, yes, there might be the benefit of really truly understanding what Shinsenbi actually means and how you apply it in your practice. Mm-hmm. But also in the deepening of your study in this, you look at the history, you look at the origin, you figure out that there's this convergence between how Kyudo has chosen to take on this term. Also gives you insight on how they were thinking when they were building the organization or trying to spread it to the rest of the world. So it's really cool how everything always comes back to there's the implicit knowledge in whatever subject you're studying, but also greater insight that you can gain when you're trying to look deeper.
Exactly. And that takes me to the next point in metaphysics. one of the great distinctions that are often used in the metaphysics is between two fundamental aspects. And like you said, there's many words and many pairs of words that we can use to describe these fundamental aspects. And it will be like from the unity, the first division will be like two different planes. So this is the origin, for example, of body and mind and matter, material and immaterial, the physical and the spiritual, the heaven and the earth, for example, all these dual things, there's a very interesting a way of putting it that I really think is very, very, useful, is dividing this in esoteric and exoteric. Okay, so this is where we're going to get a little bit esoteric. And again, I know this sounds really weird, but please let me explain. So these two aspects of exactly the esoteric, which means the external aspects, and also the esoteric, which means like the internal aspects. I really like the way in which, for example, esoteric Buddhism represents this with two different mandalas. Maybe in Shingon Buddhism, for example, in esoteric Buddhism in general, you will have a mandala that is the womb realm. I don't know, I'm not sure if I'm saying that properly. A womb or a womb, like to give birth, womb?
Yeah, a womb. Yeah.
Womb, right. So it's the womb realm, and then you have the diamond or the Vajra realm. Okay, so it will be like the two fundamental aspects. You could say that the womb realm is something like the logic of how what is materially represented is structured in such a way that it comes from a unique emanation, and how it goes through different dimensions through which it becomes diverse. Okay, so you will have like a mandala that illustrates you from a single unity. You have two or three or four or whichever fundamental divisions. And from the interaction of these fundamental divisions, you have a next layer, which is kind of like more complex, more defined. And then the interactions of this other layer create a more complex interactions, which will be like, you form a mandala. Or if you look at it sideways, it's a pyramid. In the point you have unity, and then you start having a growing diversity. Mandala is just like a pyramid looking from above, really. And you have like this for the material realm, for the womb realm, for example, which could be like the material manifestation of this. And then you also have a mandala that represents kind of like this pattern, but in the term of intelligence, of structure, of the underlying logic and intelligence underneath that manifested physical reality. So that's why you have these two, the womb and the diamond realm. So I really like that distinction, and it's really like to make the distinction between the esoteric and the exoteric. Okay, so again, another thing that you will have is that you will also have esoteric aspects to the exoteric, like internal aspects to external manifestations. And you can also have external manifestations to the internal aspects. So the idea is that in these mandalas, it's illustrated. When you see a mandala for the first time, for example, to these mandalas in particular, you look at them like, just like a picture. But when you understand what's really written there, you start looking at it as a very dynamic picture. It's really moving, just like the yin yang. I think that maybe most people heard me mention the yin yang symbol. You have it as a static symbol, but after my explanation, maybe you gave a little bit more movement to it. Mandalas work the same way. Mandalas are built in such a way that they look like static symbols, but they're actually representing very complex interactions of movements. It's not like a picture of a current state. It's more about a undergoing process, what's being illustrated. But of course, you have to learn how to look at it that way. So anyway, going back to the esoteric and to the exoteric, because I think that this is one of the terms that we should start a little bit using, or maybe not using, but understanding a little bit better. I think it's worth bringing to the discussion, to make sure that we understand what is esoteric and exoteric and what relation it has to Budo and stuff. So you can look at the mandalas. So let me go a little bit to the mandalas. So remember, each mandala, it's basically representing a twofold process. Okay, it's a process of how you go from that singularity to the diversity. Okay, how that unfolds. But also it's a way of how from the diversity you can come back to the unity. Okay, so that's normally what, for example, in symbolism, you will look like two triangles, like a triangle pointing downwards and a triangle pointing forwards, upwards. It's kind of like, it's a very common symbol in many religions and everything. And it's kind of like representing this. It's saying that each triangle is one of these realms. It will be that one on the other. And also the process of going from diversity to unity and from unity to diversity. And normally these two triangles are joined together. Putting emphasis that both things happen at the same time. They're co-dependent processes. Okay, so you'll have like these two. So let me check a little bit my notes to make sure I don't get lost in something important.
Yeah, I just want to check. We're doing close to 7:30.
Oh, all right.
In terms of your timing and in terms of how much material you want to cover, I'm just wondering if this should also be a separate section, because we're leaving kind of the Juandiego's Budo journey into a very specific field of study, which I also love to cover, and I cover it in the kind of in-depth style podcast where we talk about it. So I'm just wondering if this fits more in that space, or
Yeah, I think that that might be the case because, well, now I'm unfolding this esoteric thing, and then I'm gonna go back to how it's used to Kyudo. But yeah, it's still a little bit more distant from my experience, and I think it's more like general.
Okay, so how about we finish your experience now
Right.
with just some rapid fire questions, and then
Mhm.
let's plan for these in-depth look. And I'm wondering, because you're a professor, do you also use like PowerPoint slides or that kind of stuff to do your lectures?
Yeah, certainly, of course.
So maybe we can add in some visuals for when we have that
Yeah.
conversation. I think it would be helpful for people to see.
All right, excellent. And also, if that's possible, then when we can do the in-depth thing, because there's kind of like two parts. First is like I want to explain a system. That's what I'm trying to get to, because these distinctions of the metaphysics and everything, these end up in basically in the development of different systems. Then you will have like esoteric and exoteric systems, and I think that then. You can talk about how these systems or different types of systems are being applied and how they can be applied. And then I would like to share also like my proposals of how to apply this to Kyudo. So I think that, definitely, if we can do that in a separate session, I think that with graphics and more detailed stuff, it would be very interesting.
Yeah, I think that would totally be like a TED Talk type of thing. Just give you
that
the
would be
space.
awesome.
Yeah. So I hope you can prepare it like as if you were doing a TED Talk, and then
Right.
let's have that session.
Of course,
Okay.
excellent.
So to wrap up this one, let's just go into the rapid fire questions about you, which let's start with a pretty simple one, which is, do you have any favorite quotes or mottos or sayings?
Yeah, definitely. So I didn't like it so much. I think I have gone near and out, but I really like the famous quote by Awa Kenzo Sensei. I really like them. I think that I have gotten like to understand or relate them with a lot of information throughout the years. So I really like them. But in a more personal level, there's like a phrase I always trying to remind myself. And just for convenience, it's composed like a 4 Chinese character word. And it basically means, let me see how you say it in English. It would be like, be strict to yourself and lenient to others. And I think that this is very important, especially for me. I used to be a very, how would you say, very quick to criticize, very quick to judge. And of course, I judge others as well as I judge myself. But, I think that I always have to remind myself that judging others is not what I have to do. Just judge yourself and let other people be. This is just a personal reminder for me to balance myself out. Yeah, it's necessary for me.
Yeah, no, I experienced the same thing, and that was one of the reasons for starting something like this podcast, is to just relieve myself of any of that and have conversations where I can just be open and listen to what others have to say.
Yeah, awesome.
So next question. I think you might have, it's probably related to your metaphysics thing, but we'll see if there's maybe a practice related or teaching related thing, which is what have you changed your mind on in the last few years? Something you used to, it could be this thing about judging other people, but what other things might there be?
Right. So for example, like this will be like going out, like, after all the explanation of the metaphysics and everything, what it comes down to, one of the very important things that I think I recommend people to take into consideration is that normally Budo, when it's taught to us in such a way that it seems to be an, self-standing system. Like, for example, when you learn Kyudo, whatever it is in Kyudo, is enough by itself. So, for example, when you practice Kyudo, you learn how to concentrate, you learn how to breathe, you learn your posture, you learn how to be courteous with other people and all this stuff. But I think that that's not very true, actually. That's kind of like an ideal way of seeing it, but I don't think it's very practical. And I propose the opposite thing. And this is very much how it sums up my how I'm teaching martial arts now, and how I propose because I want to propose a system that maybe can be also explored by other people. And the idea is that instead of trying to use a Budo as a key to opening many different dimensions. It will be rather explore these different dimensions by themselves and then use them, group them together in the practice. So for example, I think that it's not possible. I think it is not going to happen. And if it happens, it's a miracle that, for example, you can learn how to breathe by practicing Kyudo. For example, breathing is super important in Kyudo, as it is in many other things. But if you tell me that by practicing Kyudo 50 years of my life, I'm going to learn how to breathe, I'm not sure, you know? I think that, for example, breathing is fundamental, and that's why it has to be practiced by itself. You know, you have to do your pranayama and your breathing exercises by themselves in order to combine them with other techniques in Kyudo. So Kyudo is not, for example, Kyudo is an example, it's not like a source of all these kind of things, but it's a place where all these things can join. So for example, Kyudo is not going to teach you biomechanics or breathing or how to manage your intentions and anything of this. But I think that rather you have to learn how to manage your intentions, understand the biomechanics, understand the anatomy, and then do your breathing exercises. And then doing this by practicing all of this separately, then you can join them together in Kyudo, and then Kyudo is going to be wonderful. So I think that that's something that has really changed. This idea of, it's kind of like also, again, triangles, you know, from going to Kyudo to this diversity doesn't work as much as going from the diversity to Kyudo and use Kyudo as a place to unify those different disciplines.
Yeah, and then if you put those two triangles together, it's like divergence to converge. And then once you've done a little more, you can diverge up again. And then, so it's just a never ending process.
Exactly. And just going ahead, you know, this process is going forth. And also these triangles, you know, that process that's going both ways. It's also part of a bigger process. So for example, this process can be also described through different ways. I like Shu-Hari, which is one that many of us really understand. So in Shu, you know, in protection, there's this interaction at a certain level. And then in Ha, you have this interaction at another level, and in Ri, you have this. But all in all, one cycle of Shu-Hari is just one unit inside Shu. Okay, so then you will have another, on a different level, Shu-Hari, and then this another level of Shu-Hari will be just one unit of Shu within another level, and so on. So it becomes like a recursive system.
No, oh man, this conversation around things inside other things that are inside, we could have this conversation for ages. I love talking about that. So we'll save that for another day. Next question would be, what is your favorite stage in the Hasetsu?
Well, definitely Sanshin. You know, Sanshin, you know, if I can go as far as to claim that my current understanding somehow of the Hasetsu is that it's only Sanshin, really. The entire process of shooting through the Shaho Hasetsu is just a process of continuous expansion in every direction. And Sanshin is just the point in which your body and your mind cannot stretch any further. So I think that in a certain sense, I think that Sanshin is the only step of the Hasetsu in a certain way, you know, because it is beautiful because your body is in its complete expansion, you know, like I always, it's a kind of like a weird way to express it, but when I sometimes explain Sanshin or the position of Sanshin, like imagine that you were going to be pulled by horses as a torture and you're going to be killed by, you know, like pulling apart. The last instant between you are torn apart, that's like basically the position in Sanshin. So I consider that Sanshin has to have a complete extension in both the horizontal and the vertical, and also conceived in the way that I proposed, for example, Kyudo. It's also the point in which your consciousness is at its highest point. It's in the maximum expansion, and maybe I can explain that next time. But it has to be basically, Sanshin is an expression of complete expansion in both planes, in the physical plane and in the immaterial plane, if you will.
Well, speaking of expansion, everyone's been in lockdown for the past year. I think all of our bellies have expanded. So what is food that you've been enjoying, or what would you consider your comfort food that's important in your life?
Right. So it's a funny question. I have to be honest, you know, and I think I wrote it somewhere that I eat a lot of coconut cookies. Coconut cookies are cheap, convenient. Like you don't need to stop doing what you're doing to eat the coconut cookies. So a very important part of my diet is that, like maybe I have a breakfast and then I don't eat anything the rest of the day. But I keep myself, every time I have a little bit of hunger, I eat a couple of coconut cookies, and that keeps me going for a few more hours. So I think that's, I really like them. Or really just any food that can be eaten very conveniently. I think cookies and bread are excellent for that, especially cookies.
Do you have a specific brand of coconut cookies you recommend?
Yeah, actually, definitely. What's the name of them? I think they're just called Coco here in Ecuador, galletas de coco, that only. But it's kind of like the square cookie with kind of like little round edges. I'm sure that this cookie must exist in every country, but under different names. But just like your standard coconut cookie.
All right, cool. And last question before we give you a chance to wrap up is, if we were to log into your YouTube account, what would we see YouTube recommend for you? So it could be videos that you have watched in the past, could be brand new videos, but because you've watched certain types, it knows what to give you.
Right. Yeah. So it's definitely, and every time I open YouTube, it welcomes me with this. I would say that half are Kyudo videos, especially the Emperor's Cup videos. I love that. I think it's incredible that those videos, there are so many of them and that they're available. I think that this is an incredible material. So look for them up. If you haven't seen this yet, please go ahead and look it up in YouTube. The Emperor's Cup Kyudo. Look at that, because there you will have the very best archers in the world at their very best. So I think that that's like a reference for the highest possible reference for Kyudo. You have these amazing archers and you have like their performance throughout the year. So then you can like pick a certain archer and see how he has changed along 10, 20 years. It's incredible. So these videos, I watch a lot of them, so they show up very often. And the other videos are going to be basically, I think, many history and philosophy, basically. You're going to have a lot of, again, historical, and sometimes I'm going to get also some very weird videos that are, for example, like mantras and mandalas and stuff like that. Also, that will happen. They will pop up very often.
So how would you like to wrap up this? Any closing messages you have for the audience?
Right. So, well, thank you for this chance. I think it's really awesome. I think that this idea of doing the podcast is amazing. I also thought about it at a certain point, when we were doing the Corona activities. I also tried another thing of the ones I did was like make the literary review and translations and all this stuff. And one of the ideas was a podcast would be amazing. But I thought it was an overwhelming thing. So I really congratulate you for your decision to do it and the excellent way you have been doing it. I'm glad I didn't do it, because I wouldn't be able to do it as good as you are doing. So to tell you that I really appreciate what you're doing. I have listened to a lot of the podcasts and I really, really enjoy them. And please keep going with them. And from my part, thank you for listening to this very, very long conversation about me. And also, please keep your ears and your eyes open for maybe next time we discuss. Because really, I think that a little bit of this theory that I want to propose, I think that it can be very, very helpful, Imagine that I have been trying, or I have had this expectation of trying to understand how important it is to translate something. But in comparison to these other things that I think are necessary to propose, this is so much more important. So if you think that translation, and if you are looking forward to having more materials in your own language, also do look forward, please, and please have a little bit of patience until I can explain. But I think that you will also really like what I will propose. So don't shut your ears when you hear words such as metaphysics and esotericism. Have a little bit of patience and an open mind, and I'm sure that this will help you somehow, even if a little bit.
Great. So in the meantime, I know that you've posted some of the translations on the Kyudo Facebook group. What are other ways people can follow your work in these areas?
Right. So now, I have been like little by little sharing a little bit of stuff, like to keep people, some of them are like, as I was telling you, it's kind of like a collage. So it's kind of like throwing the newspaper cutouts for people to, check out a little bit. A lot of my translating is done in my available time. And right now, because of, university teacher doesn't have a lot of time. So there are some periods where I cannot continue at all. And there are others where I work very intensely, but it's a very slow process. So I think that the best way would be like to please be very patient for a couple more years. Know that there's, I'm working on this and it will be available sometime, but, it's probably going to take at least a couple more years until I can do the revision and everything. But I think it's, the books I'm translating, and the first two I want to complete is the ones I told you about. And I think that it will take at least 2 more years. So just please be patient. And then when it's time, I will try to make this as available as possible. Also another thing that I try to make as possible is to make things free as possible, so that's why things takes time, because it's kind of like they're all personal things that I decide. So yeah, unfortunately, until I don't get a relief from my work, I cannot continue.
Okay, yeah, we'll pay attention and look forward to that. And if you ever wanted to just throw these little nuggets for people to sample and keep their appetite, that'd be also great.
And for sure, if you, for example, have identified me in the Kyudo group or anything, or in Facebook or whatever, and for example, if you have like, if you have any project that you would like to help translation or something, or short articles or things like this, or something like that, please be sure to write me a message. I'm really happy to help anybody that needs help with translation. Especially if it's short things, please count me in. I really like to do this. And also if you want to, for example, an article or something that is not very long, I can definitely, gladly help to do that. So please consider me as a potential translator if you need any translations.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this. And thank you so much for these last few conversations.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.